Across the heart of Asia, long-distance caravan routes once linked distant civilizations, moving luxury goods, raw materials, and cultural ideas between East and West. Modern historians often group these routes under a single label, but in reality, they formed a web of regional paths that joined and separated across mountains, deserts, and river valleys. Rather than being one continuous highway, this network functioned as a chain of connected corridors. Through them, goods produced in China and India gradually passed from merchant to merchant until they reached markets in the Middle East and the Mediterranean world. Silk became the most famous of these commodities, but it was only one part of a much broader exchange system involving textiles, spices, metals, animals, and crafted objects. In Central Asia, the region of Bactria stood at a key crossroads between Eastern and Western trade. Routes from this area stretched toward the Tarim Oases, toward northwestern India, and along great rivers that flowed toward inland seas and the steppe. Merchandise could travel north toward the Caspian region and then continue westward through mountain passes toward the Black Sea. Greek-speaking communities along those shores received eastern imports through these northern channels. These paths often avoided the main territories of powerful empires further south, instead passing through lands controlled by mountain tribes and steppe groups who taxed and protected caravans in their zones. Other routes ran directly through Iranian and Mesopotamian lands. Caravans crossed dry plateaus and desert tracts under the authority of regional powers who controlled these passages. Political rivalry between major states sometimes discouraged foreign merchants from using the most direct roads, forcing trade into alternative corridors. Even so, a small number of determined travellers managed to move across the full span of Inner Asia, linking Mediterranean markets with the Far Eastern world through a chain of intermediaries. Sea routes also played a major role in moving eastern goods westward. Ships sailed between Indian ports and the Persian Gulf, carrying cargo that had arrived overland from further east. From Gulf harbours, products were redistributed northward along great rivers into major urban centres. Desert caravan cities became vital transfer points, where maritime and overland trade met. Merchant communities there organised expeditions, recorded contracts, and left inscriptions that reveal the scale and organisation of this commerce. These hubs turned harsh desert crossings into structured trade highways, supported by wells, staging posts, and armed escorts. Beyond the settled agricultural zones lay the immense grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, home to mobile pastoral societies, famous for their riding skills. Ancient writers described these groups as fierce and independent. In the eastern steppe, powerful confederations challenged nearby empires through mounted raids and shifting alliances. Steppe exchange systems moved goods over vast distances through barter, tribute, gift-giving, and plunder. Some scholars describe these movements as steppe trade corridors parallel to the southern caravan routes. Goods could pass from tribe to tribe across thousands of kilometers without ever entering a formal marketplace. Imperial governments bordering the steppe developed economic strategies to manage these nomadic powers. Instead of relying only on warfare, they sent large quantities of manufactured goods and food supplies as diplomatic offerings. The intention was practical as well as political. Steady material support cost less than constant military campaigns and could create dependence among rival leaders. Over time, manufactured textiles, metals, and grain became tools of influence. Frontier markets were established, where nomadic groups exchanged animals and animal products for finished goods. These markets drew large volumes of traffic and became critical points of contact between mobile and settled populations. Archaeological discoveries across the steppe confirm that foreign goods travelled widely through these networks. Objects produced in one civilization appear in burials far away, showing that exchange, alliance, marriage payments, and raiding all helped redistribute material culture. The exact scale of this circulation remains difficult to measure, but the pattern is clear. The steppe was not isolated, but deeply connected to transcontinental exchange. West of China lay a basin ringed by some of the highest mountain systems on Earth, and filled by a vast desert where survival was extremely difficult. Travel across this region depended on a ring of oasis states, formed by meltwater flowing down from surrounding peaks. These small kingdoms supported caravans with food, water, animals, and guides. Two main routes developed around the desert's northern and southern edges, eventually rejoining at major junction cities. From there, roads branched again towards Central Asian valleys and major trade centres further west. Control of the corridor linking China to these oases became a strategic priority for Eastern Imperial authorities, who fortified the passage and stationed troops to protect merchants. Caravan trade along these routes moved high-value, low-bulk goods that justified the risks and costs of long transport. Silk, thread, and cloth, aromatic substances, spices, cosmetics, fine textiles, and precious metals travelled in small but profitable consignments. Merchant groups from Central Asian cities became especially active as intermediaries. Some traders covered the full distance between Central Asia and China, but many worked in segments, forwarding goods from one station to another through trusted partners. Wealthy merchant families maintained investments in multiple cities along the chain. Private letters from these traders reveal the human side of long-distance commerce. They discuss shipment divisions, profit shares, storage decisions, debts, and partnership disputes. They also describe fear, uncertainty, and the disruption caused by war. Conflicts along the routes could halt caravans entirely, leaving merchants stranded with unsold goods and blocked communications. Messages sent home speak of lost partners, failed deliveries, and the danger of dying far from one's homeland. Funds were placed in trust for children, marriages arranged from afar, and instructions given for interest-bearing investments, showing that trade networks were also social and family networks. These correspondences list the types of goods being handled: textiles, aromatic animal products, spices from India, cosmetic minerals, and silver used to balance accounts. They show careful weighing of payments and concern over missing amounts. Merchants worried about their reputations and rushed to explain discrepancies before accusations could spread. Information about market conditions travelled with these letters, warning partners when profits were falling or when certain goods were selling quickly. When frontier regions fell into disorder, the entire commercial system suffered. Caravans stopped moving, storehouses filled with undelivered cargo, and merchant communities scattered. Some traders attempted to flee unstable areas but were prevented by local authorities, or by simple lack of safe passage. Letters from such periods speak of isolation, hunger, and uncertainty about which territories remained secure. Through these personal records, the structure of the trade network becomes visible. A lattice of routes sustained by trust, correspondence, credit, and cooperation across cultures. Across Inner Asia, one of the less celebrated but highly practical trade corridors followed the great river, known today as the Oxus. Flowing between Sogdia and Bactria, it offered a natural highway for merchants moving cargo toward the northwest. From these river routes, goods could be pushed into the Caspian zone and then carried across the Caucasus, finally reaching the Black Sea coastline and the Roman world beyond. This was never an easy journey. The Caucasus could be crossed only when weather allowed, and the same mountain routes that helped trade also limited it. In winter, snow and ice turned passes into traps, and the steep valleys that guided travellers in summer became dangerous dead ends. Much of the movement through these mountains was not directed by empires, but by the people who lived there. Small communities in the highlands controlled key approaches, demanded payments, and decided who could pass safely. On the eastern side of the Black Sea, local groups held the strongest position because they commanded the final descent to the coast, where foreign merchants wanted to reach ships and harbours. Contemporary observers described how Eastern products, including goods associated with India, filtered into Greek-speaking towns around the Black Sea. The general pattern was simple. Cargo reached the Caspian shore, then travelled inland along a major river corridor to a remote pass in the Caucasus, and from there crossed to another river system that drained into the Black Sea. The route worked because rivers solved part of the transport problem. Moving freight by water, even in small boats, reduced the burden on animals and human carriers, and it allowed the same goods to cover long distances with fewer transfers. On the Black Sea side, a key river valley opened into coastal territory, linked to a major port in a rugged region north of the river mouth. This port had a reputation for being a meeting point of many peoples, and trade there could be complicated. Merchants arriving from abroad faced not only difficult terrain, but also a maze of languages and intermediaries. Business could require large teams of interpreters and brokers, because so many separate communities came into contact in a single market space. The profit could be real, but the negotiations were slow, and misunderstandings could be expensive. Once goods reached the Black Sea ports, the sea itself became the next conveyor. Coastal sailing could connect these eastern landing points to the busier harbours on the southern shore in a matter of days. From there, cargo moved inland through Anatolia to major urban markets. Some shipments also continued by ship through the narrow straits linking the Black Sea to the Aegean, where they entered wider Mediterranean exchange networks. In practice, this meant that Eastern luxuries could mingle with regional products from the Caucasus and the Black Sea: timber, metals, slaves, furs, wax, and many other commodities, before being redistributed again toward Roman consumers. Roman commanders and officials were interested in these northern corridors long before the imperial period reached its full strength. When Roman armies campaigned near the Black Sea and the Caucasus in pursuit of enemies and rebellious allies, they inevitably encountered rumours about routes that supposedly led toward the Far East. Military campaigns often doubled as reconnaissance missions, and questions about geography quickly turned into questions about trade. There was a strong temptation to believe that the Caucasus could provide a backdoor into the wealth of Asia, bypassing hostile powers further south. The region also carried a powerful mythical aura for Greco-Roman audiences, a landscape tied to heroic voyages and legendary punishments. That blend of prophet and legend made the Caucasus feel like a frontier where almost anything might be possible, if an army could survive the terrain. Some traders were bold enough to test the route in practical terms. Starting from a Roman-controlled harbour on the eastern Black Sea, travellers could move upstream by rivercraft until they reached a large fortified settlement in the interior. From there, the journey turned into a hard overland haul along an old wagon road that threaded through hills and narrow valleys. After several days, the route reached another major river system leading down toward the Caspian coast. Taken as a whole, the journey was long, hundreds of kilometres, and it demanded constant adaptation. Riverboats, pack animals, wagons, and sometimes sheer human labour all played a part, depending on the season and the condition of the road. Even when the path was known, the greatest uncertainty often came from the people who controlled the land. A traveller could not simply use the route. Passage had to be negotiated again and again. Over time, Roman influence in parts of this region grew stronger. Control extended along the Black Sea coast and reached toward the far side of the mountains, where small kingdoms served as buffers and partners. Roman strategy in the Caucasus was not only about commerce, the mountain passes were also invasion corridors, and steppe raiders could funnel through them toward Armenia and beyond. To manage this threat, garrisons were placed at choke points, walls were built across narrow gorges, and detachments were stationed so far from their bases that their presence alone signalled how seriously Rome took the frontier. Security improved, but it never became absolute. In rugged country, an ambush could still destroy a caravan or a patrol, and travellers always remained vulnerable to local violence and sudden shifts in alliance. While these northern routes offered one way for eastern goods to reach Roman markets, another major gateway lay far to the south, where Roman Syria faced Mesopotamia. Here the natural map was drawn by the Euphrates and Tigris river valleys. Caravans and boats moved along these arteries toward the immense urban centres of Babylonia, cities that had been commercial giants for centuries. Mesopotamian markets were supplied from multiple directions. Overland routes crossing Iran brought merchandise from further east, and maritime routes through the Persian Gulf delivered cargo from Indian ports. Together, these channels turned Mesopotamia into a dense commercial zone where foreign luxuries and regional staples circulated in enormous volume. Travellers coming from the Mediterranean often began in the great Syrian cities and moved east toward the Euphrates frontier. At the crossing points, officials monitored movement and collected duties on commodities leaving or entering Roman territory. These border stations could be tense places where merchants, pilgrims, and adventurers all faced interrogation. Anecdotes survived about encounters at customs posts, including stories in which officials mistook a traveller's words for a coded confession of hidden wealth. Such stories mattered because they captured something real. The border was not just a line, but a stage where suspicion, regulation, and profit all collided. Once across the river, travellers commonly joined caravans for protection. Northern Mesopotamia was a patchwork of semi-autonomous communities under larger imperial umbrellas, and caravans had to navigate local tolls, shifting authorities, and occasional violence. Not everyone in a caravan shared the same destination. Many travellers moved only to the next city, or the next market, or the next religious centre, while a smaller number pushed on for weeks. The roads pulled together people with different goals: trade, worship, diplomacy, migration, and the same convoy might carry spices and silks alongside ordinary household goods and coin. Religious travel added another layer to this movement. Large communities living in Mesopotamia maintained ties with sacred sites further west, and these obligations created regular flows of money and people across frontiers. When groups feared raids, they travelled in massive convoys. Such journeys did not transport only cash. Everyday commerce followed the same roads, and networks of family, scholarship, and trade overlapped. In this environment, merchants linked to religious communities could become important middlemen, dealing in high-value imports that moved easily across borders. Stories preserved in community traditions describe merchants known for their reliability. Figures who kept goods on reserve for customers for long periods, not because of legal contracts, but because spoken promises were treated as binding. On the Syrian coast, cities with established textile industries developed reputations for turning imported raw materials into luxury products. Dyeing workshops were especially famous, producing expensive colours that became symbols of status. Silk itself was not only an imported object of desire, it became part of a broader manufacturing world in which local artisans added value through skill, colour, and branding. Across the deserts and river valleys, small caravans carried these high-priced textiles alongside spices, perfumes, gems, and other compact goods that justified the risks of travel. The everyday mechanics of travel appear only rarely in surviving evidence, but occasional documents reveal how ordinary people planned journeys. Where to hire animals, which roads were practical, and how to reach the main crossing towns. These details matter because they show that long-distance movement depended on mundane logistics, camels, drivers, water supplies, and safe stopping places, rather than dramatic adventures alone. Interestingly, merchants did not always take the most direct path down the Euphrates. In some stretches, local power holders charged excessive tolls, turning the river road into an expensive trap. To avoid this, caravans sometimes struck out into desert zones, controlled by nomadic groups living in tents. These communities could be comparatively stable partners if they offered predictable terms, moderate fees, and reliable watering points. The detour was longer and riskier in a different way, but it reduced financial exploitation. Along these desert tracks, specialized camel drivers maintained halting stations, sometimes supplied by cisterns or by water hauled in from other places. The journey could last weeks from the frontier crossing to the major cities of central Mesopotamia, and survival depended on careful timing and discipline. At the heart of this world stood enormous cities that combined political importance with commercial magnetism. One such metropolis maintained a distinct civic identity even while living under imperial shadow. Its walls were vast, its population immense, and its streets filled with people from many backgrounds, Greek-speaking residents, Syrians, Jews, and others drawn by opportunity. The city's location gave it special advantages. Canals and rivers linked it to both major waterways, allowing goods arriving from the Persian Gulf to be redistributed deep inland. Nearby, another major city served as a political centre where the ruling court gathered seasonally. But it also functioned as a marketplace where eastern goods could be acquired without travelling further into uncertain territory. Merchants often preferred to purchase cargo there rather than push into lands where hostility and bureaucracy could close roads without warning. River travel connected these cities to the Persian Gulf. Boats moving south passed the monumental remains of ancient capitals whose grandeur outlasted their populations. Old walls and famous structures still dominated the landscape, while people had gradually relocated to newer centres that offered better protection and stronger economies. For travellers, the experience was striking. A functioning trade route running beside the half-empty shells of once dominant cities. Between Rome and the Parthian world, one desert oasis city developed a unique role that would shape the region's commerce. Sitting in the open space between two rival powers, it maintained an unusual degree of local independence. Its leaders organised their own forces, balanced diplomacy carefully, and used geography as leverage. Rather than being crushed between empires, the city turned its position into an advantage, becoming a broker for goods moving between Syria and Mesopotamia. Local regulations listed tolls on a wide range of products, showing that the oasis was not merely a checkpoint, but a true marketplace with its own consumers and economic needs. The clearest evidence for this city's growing influence comes from texts left by its people. Records that preserve names, roles, and destinations tied to caravan expeditions. They show how trade ventures were organised, who held responsibility, and which routes were favoured. Outside observers later summarised the city's function with blunt clarity. It carried luxury goods from the east into Roman lands and distributed them onward. Yet this prominence did not appear overnight. Early on, its role seems modest, with only a handful of recorded ventures. Larger Mesopotamian centres and established river routes still dominated the movement of long-distance trade. By the early 2nd century, that began to change. Caravans from the Oasis city followed a desert road to the Euphrates, deliberately avoiding regions where tolls and harassment were worst. Along the desert route, stopping points were created to supply travelers and improve safety. From the Euphrates, the trade line extended south toward the Gulf, linking desert crossing to river transport. The distances were enormous, hundreds of kilometers across open desert, and then many more along the river. Yet the route worked because it combined different modes of movement, and because it minimized costly interference along the way. This transformation was accelerated by war. A major Roman invasion into Mesopotamia initially looked like a triumph, with cities receiving the emperor and new provinces being declared. The vision behind the campaign was ambitious, and the Persian Gulf, gateway to the Indian Ocean, became a symbol of what might come next. Stories circulated about the allure of pushing further east, as if the Roman state could follow the path of earlier conquerors and reach India itself. But conquest brought new taxes, new controls, and deep resentment among local communities that had previously managed their own affairs under looser oversight. Revolt spread rapidly. Garrisons were expelled or killed, cities were punished harshly, and the region was thrown into chaos. The violence did not remain confined to Mesopotamia. Unrest and rebellion erupted in nearby provinces as well, fueled by fear, displacement, and long-standing tensions. When a new emperor took power, the decision was made to withdraw and abandon the attempt to hold Mesopotamia. That retreat reshaped the balance of the region. Some areas emerged battered and weakened, their old systems disrupted. But the Persian Gulf trade lanes remained active, and the flow of eastern goods into Mesopotamia continued. In the aftermath, the desert oasis city was in a rare position, relatively intact, militarily capable, and well-placed to fill the gap left by collapsing river towns and slow imperial recovery. With nearby communities weakened and larger powers reorganizing, the oasis city expanded its practical influence over trade corridors. Its forces began to operate more aggressively along desert routes and along the mid-Euphrates, protecting caravans and managing traffic. This mattered because river transport was cheaper and often safer for bulky cargo than pure overland haulage. Control of river islands and key stretches of waterway allowed escorts to patrol, respond to threats, and keep commerce moving. Merchants used boats to travel south with their cargo and then coordinated the return journey, so pack animals were ready where desert crossings began again. In this competition, the Persian Gulf route, combined with the desert and river system, offered an advantage over other Mediterranean supply lines. Importers using the Red Sea faced long ocean voyages and complex transfers. The Gulf routes could feed Mesopotamian markets efficiently, and from there the oasis cities' networks could move cargo to Roman Syria with remarkable speed. Faster delivery meant earlier access to consumers and better profits, and those profits helped fund further security and urban development back home. As trade expanded, the city invested more in protection. Patrols ranged into the desert, expeditions were launched against bandits, and successful commanders were honoured publicly for rescuing caravans caught in ambush. These were not imperial legions acting under distant orders, but local forces defending local interests. Yet their actions were sometimes praised by Roman officials because stable trade benefited the wider province. The records also suggest careful diplomacy on the eastern side. Merchants operating in Mesopotamian cities found ways to honour regional authorities, maintain access to markets, and avoid provoking the political powers who controlled the land. In some cases, they built religious spaces that reflected their own identity, while also acknowledging Roman imperial cult practice, signalling a deliberate balance between loyalty, opportunity, and survival. The carved honor texts left behind in Palmyra make it possible to picture how its long-distance merchant convoys were actually built and managed when they headed toward Mesopotamia. These journeys were not improvised trips made by a few traders on camels. They were organized as large, formal associations. Big traveling companies made up of many merchants who saw themselves as members of a shared enterprise. Inside each company there was a clear division of responsibilities. One senior figure handled the road itself, the planning, the schedule, the supply chain, and the constant problem of getting people and animals safely from one stopping point to the next. Another senior figure focused on the commercial side of the venture, preparing for negotiations at the destination markets, arranging buyers and partners, and handling the selling and purchasing that would make the journey worthwhile. Protection was not optional. These merchant groups routinely hired armed men because the desert tracks and river corridors were exposed to raids, extortion, and opportunistic violence. The guards were there to deter bandits, but also to discourage harassment from scattered nomads along the route. Even with security, the travellers still had to pay their way through a patchwork of territories. Money was collected from the members to cover tolls, transit fees, and what might be called protection payments, costs that were simply part of surviving a passage across lands controlled by many different local powers. The leader in charge of travel handled these negotiations. He arranged payments, argued for safe passage, and made sure the caravan did not stumble into conflict. Some texts praise individuals who brought the caravan home without charging the others. That detail hints at the financial burden of such travel. In those cases, a wealthy patron may have covered the group's expenses, effectively sponsoring the expedition and earning public gratitude in return. How often these journeys departed is not recorded in a way that allows a precise calendar, but the scale implied by the evidence suggests something steady and repeated, rather than rare. Multiple expeditions in a year is a realistic picture, with each convoy potentially carrying hundreds of merchants, workers, guards, animal handlers, and drivers. Most trips probably ended quietly, with no need for dramatic public commemoration. The surviving texts tend to highlight unusual moments, rescues, exceptional generosity, or acts of protection that stood out because they were not routine. Occasionally, a dedication appears that clearly honoured someone important, yet the exact reason was not explained. One example is a public honour paid to a Roman officer by a returning convoy, with the details left unstated. That silence itself is revealing. Something significant happened, but the audience at the time needed no explanation, while later readers are left only with the outline. The appeal of Palmyra's route lay in reliability. Other paths through the Euphrates frontier crossed fractured political ground where local communities extracted heavy tolls, and where banditry could flourish without any single authority capable of controlling it. Palmyra, in contrast, offered a corridor overseen by one strong city-state that could impose discipline, maintain supply points, and punish threats when needed. That kind of accountability encouraged merchants to choose the Palmyrene road, even if the landscape itself remained harsh. As these contacts deepened, Palmyrene influence began to appear beyond its own desert. Palmyrenes are found holding recognized positions in the Gulf-facing kingdom that dominated commerce arriving through the Persian Gulf. Whether these titles were granted internally by merchant communities or formally recognized by local rulers, the practical effect was the same. Palmyrene officials in the region were able to smooth the path for arriving caravans, help resolve problems, and provide local support. This mattered because the Gulf entry point was one of the most important commercial funnels in the ancient Near East. The port city at the head of the Gulf was not just a destination, It was a meeting ground where traders from multiple directions gathered. The city itself had to defend against the river's floods with raised embankments, and over time the coastline shifted as the river deposited silt and pushed the shore farther outward. By the time a Roman emperor reached the area during his eastern campaign, this was a place where foreign ships could be seen at anchor, and crews from Arabia and India could be encountered in the same harbour zone. By the middle of the 2nd century, Palmyrene merchants were no longer limiting themselves to river and desert routes into Mesopotamia. Evidence points to some of them joining the wider ocean system that linked the Gulf to northwestern India. These voyages would have been long, extending well beyond 2,000 kilometers in total, and they likely involved calls at ports along the Arab and Iranian coasts. Palmyrene tomb art helps confirm that this was not a fantasy. Images of ships appear in the city's funerary culture, suggesting that certain families had real ties to maritime trade, perhaps even owning vessels operating out of the Gulf. The sea lanes themselves were never fixed. Ports rose quickly, and merchants constantly adjusted their routes to follow opportunity. Reports reaching the Mediterranean described how certain harbours in the Gulf were becoming especially popular, even when older surveys of the region had not mentioned them. That kind of detail shows the speed of commercial change. New docking points could become essential within a generation, pulled into the system by demand, safe anchorage, political stability, or the presence of intermediaries who made transactions easier. The goods that Palmyra pushed into Roman markets were exactly the kind of cargo that rewarded long-distance risk. Compact, expensive, and in high demand. Fine Eastern textiles, especially silk and other luxury fabrics, were central because they could be packed densely and sold at a large margin. Finds from Palmyrene burials underline how valued such cloth was, and local sculpture suggests a taste for layered, delicate garments among elite women. Alongside fabrics came medicines, spices and aromatic substances, incense, resins, and perfume materials associated with Arabia and beyond. Pearls also flowed through the Gulf system, and Palmyrene art reflects their popularity as jewellery in wealthy circles. Trade did not run only one way. Merchants heading to Mesopotamia needed goods and currency to exchange. Roman and Syrian products had value in Eastern markets: textiles, coral, scented mixtures, wines, metalwork, and luxury items made of gold and silver. Palmyra could also export food products from its Oasis territory, dates and wine among them, items that could be traded for spices or used to supply travellers and stations along the route. Human cargo was part of this world as well. The frontier story about a traveller questioned by customs officers hints at a traffic in skilled slaves, a trade that, however uncomfortable to modernise, was woven into the economic fabric of the era. Gold coin also moved through these channels, and some dedications indicate that large sums could be provided as support for merchant groups, possibly to finance travel costs, settle accounts, or stabilise a venture during difficult times. After caravans returned to Palmyra, the next stage was distribution within Roman territory. This part is harder to trace because the evidence focuses mainly on the Mesopotamian side, where the long-distance challenge was greatest. Still, the basic logic is clear. Once the caravan reached the safety of Roman provinces, the large travelling company could break apart into smaller groups, each aiming for its preferred market. The Syrian capital was a major target, sitting a few hundred kilometers away, and there are signs that officials there were deeply involved in taxing incoming Eastern imports. Coastal ports along Phoenicia also mattered, because they connected the caravan world to Mediterranean shipping. From these harbours, cargo could be loaded onto vessels moving up and down the Levantine coast and onward across the sea. The mechanics of coastal shipping are well illustrated by surviving narratives about travel along the Phoenician shoreline, describing cargo ships moving from port to port and linking cities in a predictable rhythm. Goods arriving by camel and caravan could be transferred into the same maritime flow. A rare and valuable glimpse into the reality of these imports comes from a physician who described obtaining Indian drug materials in the Levant. He emphasized that the substances had just arrived with larger shipments brought in by camel transport and were not native to the region. That kind of observation fits perfectly with a supply chain running through Mesopotamian markets, and then westward through Palmyra. This system was profitable, but fragile. In the middle of the 2nd century, Parthian politics shifted as a new ruler consolidated power and began restoring authority over territories that had drifted or broken away. The Gulf-facing kingdom was drawn back under tighter control, and a record survives stating that its local king was driven out and replaced. That change mattered because it redirected revenues from trade, and it altered the conditions under which foreign merchant communities operated. Palmyrene traffic did not end immediately, and in fact, a cluster of honours to one prominent Palmyrene appears in a short span of years, suggesting a period when merchant networks needed unusual support. It may indicate heightened risk, heavier pressure, or the need for skilled negotiation to keep caravans functioning. The tightening grip did not stop at the Gulf. Soon, Armenia became the next flashpoint, and the region slid into a larger war between the Roman and Parthian powers. Syria itself came under invasion, and Roman forces eventually responded by marching east and striking major Mesopotamian cities. Even when the Roman army achieved dramatic victories, the wider outcome was disastrous for trade. War disrupted markets, destroyed infrastructure, and made long routes unsafe. Armies seized supplies, cities burned, and merchants lost goods in transit. Then, a major pandemic spread through the empire and the army, weakening recovery and deepening the shock. For a long stretch after the war began, public records of Palmyrene caravans fall silent. The gap suggests not a temporary inconvenience, but a collapse of the conditions that made long-distance commerce possible. Safe stations, protected river crossings, stable markets, and trusted contacts at the far end. Palmyra's own soldiers played a complicated role in this. The city defended the frontier with its own forces, yet many Palmyrenes also served within Roman units. From the perspective of an enemy army, that distinction meant little. Outposts and patrol points connected to Palmyra's trade corridor would have been obvious targets. If those positions were destroyed, the city would lose not only its access to eastern markets, but also the protective network that allowed caravans to move at all. Even if some merchants survived, their commercial world would have been stripped away in a matter of years. When the fighting eased, the old Mesopotamian routes were still likely dangerous. Displaced populations, retaliation, and lingering insecurity could poison a trade road long after treaties were signed. In that climate, many Palmyrene merchants shifted their focus toward Roman Egypt, a safer zone under firm imperial control with its own established system for importing eastern goods through the Red Sea. A major hub on the Nile became a gathering point for these merchants. There, a large trading headquarters was established, apparently funded at great personal cost by a leading figure within the community. The dedication to him praises the construction of an impressive complex with gateways and colonnades, and the decoration of the building included images of merchant pairs, carved in the distinctive style of Palmyra. The message was clear. Even far from home, the community rebuilt its commercial identity and created a base strong enough to handle large volumes of cargo. Other Egyptian inscriptions confirm that Palmyrenes were active in this environment not only as merchants, but also as ship captains or ship owners connected to Red Sea commerce. Their reach extended to southern Arabian ports on the way to India, and archaeological finds hint at the practical realities of trade. Containers marked for destinations far away, suggesting that Palmyrene traders took orders across the Mediterranean world and organized shipments accordingly. Goods could now be routed through either Egypt or Mesopotamia, depending on security, politics, and profit. This flexibility helps explain why Persian products appear among taxable imports, entering Egypt during this period. Merchants were blending supply chains rather than relying on a single corridor. The Roman state responded to these commercial realities by posting Palmyrene soldiers in Egypt's desert zones. Camels, archery, and desert endurance made them ideal for patrol work and for guarding the caravans that carried Red Sea cargo across harsh land to the Nile. Some dedications left by these soldiers combined devotion to Eastern gods with acknowledgement of Roman imperial cult, reflecting a dual identity shaped by service and homeland. The wealth displayed in certain sanctuary offerings suggests that at least some of these soldiers had access to money beyond a normal military wage. This has led to the idea that protection and commerce may have intersected, with soldiers using their position to favour merchants and merchants rewarding them in return. Whether this was official policy or informal practice, it fits the pattern of how trade often worked in frontier zones. Security and profit were rarely separate worlds. Palmyra's trade records continue into the 3rd century, but by then the city's role was no longer limited to commerce. It began to act as a political power with military reach, eventually producing a ruler who tried to carve out control over the Roman East during a time of imperial weakness. For a brief moment, Palmyra stood at the centre of regional power struggles, defending frontiers against new eastern dynasties, while also pursuing its own ambitions. That gamble failed. A Roman emperor defeated the Palmyrene regime, took its queen captive, and displayed her in a triumphal procession. After a final uprising, the city was crushed and brought firmly under imperial control. In the generations that followed, its distinct character faded. The great merchant networks that once made Palmyra famous were broken, and the Oasis that had once acted as a bridge between worlds settled into the quieter life of a provincial town watched over by a garrison. Long before the Parthian kings controlled Iran, an earlier empire had already carved a hard spine of travel through the plateau, a long-distance highway designed for speed, control, and communication across an enormous territory. Centuries later, the Parthians inherited this idea of an imperial road and used the same broad corridor for their own needs. It became the dependable route that carried rulers between their Mesopotamian power base and the cooler eastern capitals they preferred in summer. Yet this was never only a royal convenience. Once a road exists, commerce follows. The same corridor evolved into one of the most important overland channels, linking the wealthy markets of Mesopotamia with the cities and caravan hubs of Central Asia. From the Mesopotamian side, trade traffic split into different branches. One northern branch ran toward the Caspian and then hugged its southern edge, skirting the greener strip between water and mountains before reaching the open lands above Iran. Merchants moving along this line were not only locals. Traders from Armenia and Media, people accustomed to dealing across borders and languages, appear in the picture as regular participants. They carried Indian and Persian goods out of Mesopotamian cities and pushed them toward the northern margins of the Parthian world, where steppe peoples waited beyond the settled zones. On the eastern Caspian shore, a powerful group controlled access to the coastline and profited by acting as brokers. They grew rich by receiving luxury cargo brought by camel caravans and then feeding it onward into the wider steppe economy. Their wealth became visible in the most direct way possible. Outsiders described them wearing gold ornaments, an unmistakable sign that this frontier trade could turn distant goods into local power. Other branches of the Overland network ran straight across the Iranian plateau toward Bactria and the lands beyond. Mesopotamia was a collector's basin, pulling in products from the Mediterranean world as well as from India and Arabia. Once these items reached major cities in the Parthian realm, they did not simply stop there. Many were forwarded eastward by caravan, feeding the commercial systems of Central Asia. People in the Far East were aware that goods identified with Rome were arriving through intermediaries, and lists of these imports paint a picture of abundance. Precious metals, jewellery, gemstones, coral, amber, glass, pigments, fine textiles, embroidered fabrics, elaborate clothing, and unusual materials that sounded exotic, even to those cataloguing them. The point was not that every item originated in Roman workshops. The point was that the Roman label had become a shorthand for a certain kind of luxury package entering Central Asian markets. In reality, a surprising amount of what was sold under a Roman name began its life elsewhere. Goods moved west, were altered, refined, or reworked by skilled craftspeople in Mediterranean cities, and then returned east as upgraded products. Even silk could make this round trip. Cloth that started in the workshops of the Far East might later reappear in Eastern markets as a finer, lighter fabric produced by Roman looms, with a different texture and a different prestige. Rome, in this sense, was not only a consumer, it was a processing centre, an empire that could take imported materials, remake them, and sell them back at a higher value. This flow of profit explains a crucial barrier in the system. The Parthian world sat between Rome and the deep interior of Asia, and Parthian merchants had every reason to keep it that way. The main land routes through Iran carried large volumes of silk and other prized goods. If Roman traders could travel freely along those roads, they would negotiate directly with producers and inland markets, shrinking the profits of the intermediaries. Instead, Roman buyers were effectively kept on the western side of the Parthian system. They could come as far as the great bazaars near the imperial capital, purchase textiles at inflated prices, and then return. Far Eastern records even preserve the idea that the Parthians deliberately prevented direct contact so that they could remain the indispensable middleman, the gatekeeper who earned money from both ends of the chain. This policy was not only about money. Parthia faced serious pressure on its eastern frontiers from ambitious powers and mobile peoples who could raid deep into settled lands. Allowing steady and direct communication between Rome and those eastern rivals was not in Parthia's interest. If two great empires began sharing routes and information, the Middle Kingdom could be squeezed. Blocking direct travel reduced the risk of coordinated diplomacy or military planning that might threaten Parthian security. In that sense, controlling trade routes was also controlling geopolitics. Against that background, one overland venture stands out as a rare exception. Around the beginning of the 2nd century, a merchant operating within the Roman world managed to send agents along the Iranian route into Inner Asia. The journey was unusual enough that geographers later used the information to improve their understanding of the Eastern map. The route followed the logic of the plateau. It left the Mesopotamian capital zone, climbed into the Zagros, crossed the high Iranian interior, and reached the important royal and administrative centres that anchored Parthian power. From there, the road continued through the eastern provinces, passing cities that served as staging points for caravans heading towards Central Asia. To grasp the scale, it helps to think in weeks rather than days. The line from the Mesopotamian heartland to the great Oasis cities of the northeast was more than 1,000 kilometers, and the full distance to the edge of Bactria was greater still. This was a world of harsh uplands, long waterless stretches and sudden changes of climate. Travellers moved with pack animals, hired guides, and depended on towns that functioned like islands, places where fodder, grain, repairs, and news could be obtained. These towns were not merely dots on a map. They were the skeleton that held the road together. Beyond the northeastern staging points, the path entered Bactria and then climbed toward the Palmyra region, a landscape of high valleys and cold passes that acted as a natural gate between Western and Eastern Central Asia. Somewhere in this mountainous zone stood a famous market hub, less a city of stone walls and more a recognized meeting place, where traders from different directions could exchange cargo and turn back. This was the kind of site where silk moving out of China could be met by merchants arriving from the west, and where Indian goods could shift hands toward northern or western buyers. It sat close to the routes that led onward to the Tarim Oases, where the desert rim kingdoms served as stepping stones toward the Chinese interior. By the time a caravan reached this high market, it was already thousands of kilometers from Mesopotamia. The full distance to the Chinese capital was far beyond what most people would attempt in one continuous journey. Trade worked because it was broken into segments. One group specialized in the Iranian plateau, another in Bactria, another in the Tarim, and others again in the Chinese frontier zones. Goods travelled farther than most humans ever did. Yet over time, Parthian travellers and merchants did begin to reach China, and contact was not only commercial. Religious movements also followed these same corridors. Individuals from Parthian lands arrived in the Chinese capital and built reputations as teachers and translators, drawing followers and shaping the local understanding of Buddhism. In at least one case, a merchant later joined such a mission, showing how trade and belief could overlap along the same roads. The rare Roman-led venture into Inner Asia depended on a brief window of stability. Conditions across the route were unusually favourable. The Tarim corridor was under strong control again, making the desert edge passages safer. The Kushan realm, which held Bactria and the approaches to the Palmyras, was politically secure, and the Western empires were not actively at war. In a normal decade, any one of those pieces could fail. A rebellion in the Tarim Oases could close the road. A shift in Kushan politics could make passage dangerous. A renewed Roman-Parthian conflict could end the possibility of a Roman-linked caravan crossing Iran at all. That is exactly what happened soon after. Revolt and instability returned to the Tarim, and not long afterward, major war broke out in the Near East again. Under those conditions, it is difficult to imagine many Roman subjects travelling safely across Iran to the Palmyras. Ancient geography, as it was later recorded, treated that one expedition as virtually unique. And even that journey took an unexpected turn at its farthest reach. While the agents were conducting business at the high market, they were seized by representatives of an unknown power and carried eastward into territories that lay beyond the normal horizon of Western knowledge. The accounts place this moment at the edge of the mapped world where rumour and reality blend. The rulers of Rome understood that the world did not end at their frontiers. Beyond the provinces and client kingdoms lay distant political powers with their own courts, armies, and ambitions. From time to time, messengers arrived from faraway regions that Romans could not control and barely imagined in detail. Delegations from India and even from lands deeper in Inner Asia. These visits offer a rare window into how Rome pictured the wider map of the ancient world and how the empire interpreted its place within it. Modern readers often want a clear statement of Roman foreign policy. as if the empire kept orderly archives that set out long-term goals, fixed strategies, and official instructions. But Rome did not operate like that. There was no permanent diplomatic service with a consistent doctrine and no large bureaucratic structure devoted to maintaining a single, unified plan. Big decisions clustered around the emperor and a small circle of trusted advisors. That meant the tone and direction of imperial action could shift with personality, personal priorities, private fears, and the political needs of the moment. The empire was enormous, yet its highest decisions often reflected the worldview of a remarkably small elite. The writers who described the arrival of distant envoys were rarely positioned at the center of power. They were not usually present when private conversations happened, and even when they lived in Rome, they tended to see only what was meant to be seen. High-level discussions took place behind closed doors. The broader public encountered foreign delegations through orchestrated appearances, carefully arranged ceremonies, public games, formal processions, and official events, where the message mattered as much as the meeting. Visitors were treated as honored guests, but they were also part of a performance designed to communicate Rome's authority. For most people, the meaning of these embassies did not come from treaty clauses or secret negotiations. It came from spectacle. The crowd saw the emperor receiving exotic representatives from the edge of the known world, and the crowd drew conclusions about Rome's greatness. Many surviving narratives reflect that excitement and curiosity more than they reflect the practical business of diplomacy. The earliest state-level contacts between Rome and rulers connected to India took shape in the age of Augustus, when the Roman world was being reorganized after years of civil war. Augustus later claimed that foreign representatives from India came to him more than once, and he presented their appearance as a novelty, something no earlier Roman commander had experienced. The statement worked well as propaganda. It implied that Rome's new stability and power had reached so far that distant kings now sought friendship on Rome's terms. These first approaches were shaped by the politics of the lands east of Parthia, where Indo-Scythian and related rulers controlled regions that bordered the Parthian sphere. At roughly the same time, Greco-Roman merchants expanded their reach. After Egypt was secured, shipping in the Red Sea grew rapidly, and fleets sailed in larger numbers toward the Indian Ocean. Merchants carried not only cargo but news. Ports and marketplaces in the east began to hear that the Mediterranean had been gathered under a single ruler, and that a new imperial system had replaced the old rival kingdoms. Rumours of Roman intentions travelled as quickly as spices and textiles. Stories that Rome was preparing campaigns in Arabia, or that a major war against Parthia might soon follow. Those rumours mattered in India. Rulers in the north had long memories, shaped by stories of Alexander's march into the east, and the idea of a Western conqueror moving through Persia still carried political weight. If a new Western emperor seemed poised to challenge Parthia, then Eastern kings had incentives to make contact early, either to hedge their bets, to seek advantage, or to position themselves on the winning side of a conflict that might reshape the map. Against that background, a first group of envoys reached Augustus while he was far from the eastern frontier, occupied with difficult warfare in Spain. Later, writers described this as a voluntary tribute to Augustus's fame, as if distant peoples had simply heard of his virtue and hurried to honour him. That framing reflects the Roman habit of turning diplomacy into moral theatre. Even when the account preserves a kernel of truth, it is wrapped in a self-serving message. The world seeks Rome because Rome is worthy. A more substantial approach came when Augustus moved into the eastern Mediterranean and made his presence felt among the Greek cities. Another delegation arrived, linked to a powerful Saka ruler whose influence stretched across several kingdoms in the Indus region and the lands around Gujarat. This ruler expected a Roman clash with Parthia and wanted to shape what would follow. The Saka court had inherited the legacy of Greek-speaking elites in parts of India, and it understood how to communicate with Roman audiences. The envoys carried a letter written in Greek, a strategic choice that reduced distance and made the message feel familiar. The ruler also employed a carefully selected historical parallel. He cast himself as a new version of an Indian king from the era of Alexander, the kind of opponent who could become an ally. The implication was clear. If Rome marched east as Alexander once had, this Indian ruler wanted to be treated as a partner rather than an obstacle. He signalled willingness to cooperate, to allow passage, and to assist in honourable ventures, language that flattered Roman ambition without placing his own realm in a submissive position. Witnesses along the route described the envoys as a curiosity in themselves. By the time they appeared in the great Syrian cities, their journey had already claimed lives. Only a small number survived to reach the imperial court. The fact was impossible to ignore. Distance was not an abstract idea, but a physical ordeal of climate, disease, exhaustion, and uncertainty. The emperor received them while holding court on a Greek island, amid an atmosphere of formal business and choreographed ceremony. A friendship agreement was announced, though details remain vague in later narratives. The public learned that ties had been formed, and that alone was enough to feed the belief that Rome's influence had expanded. The political value of this theatre was obvious. Augustus could be presented as receiving recognition that even Alexander had to travel to obtain. The message was subtle, but powerful. Rome's leader did not need to go to India. India came to him. Whether Augustus consciously leaned into Alexander's image or simply allowed the comparison to spread, the effect was the same. It amplified his aura at home and unsettled enemies abroad. A Parthian king facing internal tensions might have viewed these contacts with concern, not because India would immediately send armies, but because the optics suggested Rome was building friendships on Parthia's far side. Yet the grand invasion never happened. Instead, Augustus reached a celebrated settlement with Parthia through diplomacy. Captured standards and prisoners were returned, and the result was presented inside the empire as a victory achieved through intimidation alone. The public story implied that Parthia had been forced to comply and even to offer hostages as proof of submission. With that success claimed, Augustus shifted his attention to other frontiers. In the east, direct political contacts with the Saka world fade from view, and the moment of dramatic expectation passes. Even so, the theme of Indian embassies remained useful to Augustus's reputation, and later, accounts add further exotic gifts to the story, including the arrival of large wild cats that amazed Roman crowds. Whether these were connected to additional Indian contacts or to other eastern channels, they served the same function. Evidence in Roman eyes that unprecedented wonders now moved under the shadow of the emperor. Farther south, a different kind of relationship formed between Rome and the Tamil regions of the Indian peninsula. By the late 20s, before the Common Era, Roman merchants were reaching southern Indian ports. Here, the motivations were not primarily military. Tamil rulers wanted prestige, information, and control of trade. They were curious about the distant power that was suddenly appearing in their coastal marketplaces, and they were eager to shape the terms under which foreign merchants operated. The first southern contacts likely developed unevenly. One coastal polity benefited early from Roman arrivals, receiving valuable overseas goods that could be framed as prestigious gifts. Rival chiefdoms, not wanting to fall behind, sought their own connections. That competitive dynamic pushed leaders to send emissaries toward the Mediterranean world. One such embassy is described as arriving with honor gifts, precious stones and pearls from the rich fisheries of the southern seas. Those offerings were carefully chosen. Pearls, especially, were becoming objects of intense desire in Roman elite culture. Bringing pearls to the emperor was not only a gesture of respect, it was an advertisement of what the Tamil ports could supply in quantity. The journey itself became part of the story. Later, writers emphasized how long it took, portraying the envoys as people who had crossed an entire world and arrived beneath a different sky. They listed impressive gifts, sometimes including elephants, and they treated the length of the trip as a tribute as meaningful as the objects carried. Such language again reveals the Roman habit of turning geography into a moral statement. Distant peoples travel far because Rome is worth reaching. More than one Tamil polity may have sent representatives, and later traditions blend different embassies together, sometimes confusing identities. Even so, the basic pattern is clear. Southern rulers had strong incentives to manage Roman trade, because the flow of silver and gold leaving the Mediterranean for Indian goods became enormous. Roman money poured into India year after year, and a large share of it ended up in the southern port systems. That wealth altered local politics. Control of key harbours became a reason for rivalry and conflict, and poems and legends recall struggles around major market towns where foreign trade concentrated. For Augustus, receiving these southern envoys added another layer to his cultivated image. These were representatives from lands beyond even the furthest reach of Alexander's campaigns, and their presence suggested that Rome's commercial networks now penetrated deeper into the Indian Ocean world than classical armies ever had. The gifts also hinted at new profits. Gemstones, pearls, and luxury products from the south rapidly became fashionable in the Roman elite imagination. By receiving envoys in impressive settings and accepting their offerings, Augustus helped create a framework of goodwill that benefited trade, even if no formal treaty language survives. Tamil leaders likely interpreted these early connections through the logic of personal status. In a political culture where prestige relationships mattered, trade could be described as gift exchange between rulers, rather than as a cold commercial transaction. Roman merchants would not have resisted that interpretation. Being associated with the emperor increased their standing in distant ports and made business easier. The construction of an Augustan temple in a southern harbour fits this pattern. It was probably built by merchants rather than ordered by the imperial court. But locally, it could be understood as a kind of residence or sacred marker of the emperor's presence. Images of the ruler, resembling those on Roman coins that circulated as payments and gifts, reinforce the idea that Rome's power wasn't only economic, but also symbolic. After the age of Augustus, Roman emperors no longer kept direct diplomatic ties with the kingdoms of India. The early imperial period had brought internal stability, secure borders, and economic growth, so distant lands no longer seemed politically urgent. India, once viewed as mysterious and remote, became instead a familiar destination for merchants. Trade routes across the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean were now active and dependable. Roman traders regularly visited Indian ports and Eastern luxuries. Spices, gemstones, textiles, and exotic materials circulated widely across Roman cities and provinces. Commercial relationships replaced formal diplomacy. Roman merchants built working partnerships with local rulers and port authorities. They negotiated customs, harbour access, and security arrangements themselves, without needing imperial ambassadors. These traders often appeared directly at royal courts, offering gifts and trade goods in exchange for privileges and protection. Indian rulers welcomed the revenue and prestige such exchanges brought. Local authorities sometimes even provided pilot boats and escorts to guide foreign ships through dangerous river mouths and coastal waters, ensuring safe arrival and departure. Maritime commerce functioned through practical cooperation rather than treaties. Even with frequent voyages, the Far East still held surprises for the Roman world. Sri Lanka, known through traveller reports, was sometimes imagined as part of a vast southern continent. A turning point came when a Roman tax contractor's freedman, blown off course during a voyage, reached the island alive after weeks at sea. Carried before local officials, he presented Roman silver coins and identified himself as connected to imperial administration. Recognized as a figure of importance, he was received at the royal court and treated as an honored guest. During his stay, he learned the local language and described Roman government, military strength, and economic organization. The Roman silver coins he carried made a deep impression. Their consistent weight and purity stood in contrast to many regional coinages, whose metal content varied. Their sharp stamped images also signaled advanced minting techniques. To the island court, these coins suggested a state with reliable authority and financial discipline. Interest grew in establishing formal contact. A diplomatic mission was organized and envoys were sent westward to meet the Roman emperor. Their leader carried a title that likely indicated administrative rank, rather than a personal name. Reports later connected this mission with the acquisition of rare red coral from Mediterranean sources, a material highly valued in South Asian religious culture and eventually donated to a major shrine. For Rome, the arrival of these distant envoys carried symbolic weight. It suggested that imperial influence reached to the edges of the known world. Yet official records focused less on spectacle and more on useful knowledge. Roman administrators were interested in geography, governance, trade systems, and social customs. Accounts that circulated among elites sometimes reshaped these foreign societies into moral examples, portraying them as places where rulers were restrained by councils and could be removed for misconduct. Such descriptions reflected internal political debates more than foreign reality. This exchange marked the only clearly recorded direct diplomatic contact between Rome and Sri Lanka, but it strengthened commercial confidence and widened maritime ambition. With more ports considered friendly and accessible, Roman shipping pushed farther across the Indian Ocean. Merchants also served another role beyond trade. Roman commanders recognized that experienced traders could travel where soldiers and officials could not. Some were quietly used as intelligence gatherers, messengers, and negotiators. In the eastern frontier regions, agents drawn from merchant communities carried letters, arranged meetings with client kings, and observed political conditions. Inscriptions from desert caravan cities record individuals sent on sensitive missions to Gulf and Near Eastern courts on behalf of Roman leaders. Imperial authorities sometimes dispatched special agents to obtain rare commodities unavailable through normal trade. Missions were launched to secure amber, ivory, unusual dyes, exotic animals, and luxury fabrics. Not all of these efforts succeeded. Some emperors ordered extensive searches for particular materials only to have their agents return empty-handed. These failures were remembered precisely because they showed the limits of imperial reach, despite claims of universal power. Diplomatic maneuvering also extended deep into Asia through indirect channels. During conflicts with Parthia, Roman commanders received envoys from regions on Parthia's borders, seeking alliances. To protect such visitors from interception, Roman escorts sometimes redirected them along sea routes, tied to Indian Ocean commerce, bypassing hostile territory entirely. This shows how maritime trade networks doubled as diplomatic corridors. Meanwhile, in East Asia, renewed military expansion restored Chinese control over Central Asian corridor states. With these routes reopened, Chinese authorities gathered more reports about a powerful empire far to the west. They called it a Great Western Realm, describing its people as orderly, tall, and trustworthy in trade. They believed this distant state collected rare goods from many lands. Intermediary powers, especially Parthia, were said to block direct contact in order to preserve their own trading advantages. Military technology shaped these perceptions. Central and East Asian steel reached Western markets through intermediaries and was admired for its quality, though its manufacturing methods were not widely understood in the Mediterranean world. Steppe and Iranian cavalry forces used advanced metal equipment and powerful bows, advantages that had once contributed to devastating Roman defeats in desert campaigns. In contrast, East Asian armies employed sophisticated crossbows with precision triggers and sighting systems, weapons tightly controlled to prevent foreign copying. Chinese frontier commanders sought Western partners to stabilize Central Asia and eventually sent an envoy on a long overland journey intended to reach Roman territory. After crossing multiple regions and arriving near the Persian Gulf, the envoy prepared for a sea voyage, believing it was the only route forward. Local sailors exaggerated the dangers and duration of the passage, demanding heavy payment and warning of years at sea. Discouraged and exhausted, the envoy abandoned the attempt and returned with the mistaken conclusion that no practical route existed. Because of this report, further missions were not sent at that time. By the year 100, Han power had pushed back into the Tarim Basin so firmly that Chinese troops were operating close to the Palmyra Mountains, looking west and weighing what might come next. The commander who had made that frontier possible was Banchow. He had spent roughly 30 years campaigning, negotiating, and fighting to keep the Oasis aligned with the Han. But time had caught up with him. Age and illness were beginning to set the pace, and just as his strength was fading, fresh reports arrived about a vast empire far beyond the western horizon, a power known in China as Da-Qin. The news sounded extraordinary, yet it also underlined a hard truth. The lands beyond the Pamirs were still out of reach in any direct, reliable way. When Banchow asked to step down and return home, he did not simply send a letter. He sent his son to the emperor with the formal request, and he also arranged something more theatrical and more persuasive. If the court in Luoyang needed reminding of how far his influence had stretched, then living proof would speak louder than a list of victories. So he dispatched foreign visitors from the most distant places touched by his long campaign. People whose clothing, languages, and faces would make the court feel the scale of his work at a glance. Among them were representatives said to come from a far-off land recorded under names that sounded like Mengchi and Tule. The official record presents their appearance as a submission to Han authority, describing envoys arriving with tribute from very remote states. The reported distance was enormous, tens of thousands of LEI from the capital, which has encouraged later readers to suspect that these visitors belong to regions that, in a Western map, would fall somewhere inside Roman territory. The strange names themselves became part of the mystery. Some have suggested the sounds could match a familiar Western place name, something like Macedonia. That is possible, but there is another explanation that fits the rough realities of long-distance travel. Foreigners crossing many borders often learn to repeat certain phrases that help them survive checkpoints and suspicious officials. They might not have been trained diplomats at all. They could have been merchants moving along established routes, doing what traders always did, speaking the words that opened gates, won escorts, and avoided fights. A story from the Greco-Roman geographical tradition offers a clue. It describes a merchant from the Roman world, a man named Gnaeus Titianus, who did not travel to the Far East himself but sent agents eastward, gathering information from their journey. Those agents, according to the account, aimed for a key trading point near the Palmyras, a place remembered as the Stone Tower, a kind of commercial staging ground at the edge of the great mountain corridors. In that region, they met people described as the Silk People, and their trip continued in conditions that sounded brutal even by caravan standards. Months of hardship, dangerous weather, and a long trek across bleak terrain until they reached a large inland city, identified as the Silk Capital. The journey was treated as remarkable, precisely because so few from the Roman world had ever pushed that far. The merchant who commissioned it later wrote about the distances and stages, and that information circulated among mapmakers, who were trying to estimate how wide Asia truly was. This is where the puzzle begins to connect. If a Roman-linked trading party reached the Palmyra region at just the moment when Chinese forces were active there, it is easy to imagine how the encounter unfolded. A foreign caravan appears in contested territory. Armed escorts intercept it. The travellers are not killed or robbed, but instead placed under guard and brought to the frontier commander. Banchow had every reason to treat unknown Westerners as important. They were evidence that the western edge of his world was not empty, and they were potential tools for future policy. The safest assumption is that the merchants complied because compliance was the only sensible option. In a world of empires and fortified passes, resisting a military escort would have been suicidal. Once in Han hands, the visitors could be folded into the political theatre of the frontier. At that time, many small kingdoms and communities were arriving at the Han capital to acknowledge the empire's renewed strength. Against that background, the appearance of odd Western foreigners could be presented as yet another distant submission, even if the visitors themselves understood their mission in purely commercial terms. They may have struggled to communicate, but they could still demonstrate what mattered, where they had come from, what goods they carried, and that they were connected to powerful markets far away. At the imperial court, the exchange would have been reshaped by protocol. What merchants thought of as trade goods could be interpreted by officials as tribute. The visitors were likely carrying silk acquired along the routes, and also gold coins from the Roman world, coins that looked unlike anything in common Chinese use. Han currency was not built around a shared gold coinage, and officials who had never handled Roman gold might naturally interpret such pieces as official tokens, perhaps even as a kind of royal seal because of the portraits stamped on them. In the ceremonial language of empire, the objects could be recorded as the seal of a foreign ruler rather than as money carried by traders. Meanwhile, the court's response would be lavish by design. Diplomacy demanded that the Han display wealth and authority, rewarding foreign submitters with valuable gifts that proclaimed imperial supremacy. Back in the West, the merchant sponsor would have viewed the episode through a colder lens. He would see profit, not submission. If his agents returned with fine gifts from the Han court, those gifts would be assets, proof of access and prestige, a story that could attract partners and investors. The account claims that the journey was so unusual that it inspired a written report, though that book no longer survives. Even so, the story left traces. Later, writers knew enough about the expedition to treat it as a rare window into the far edges of Asia, and the family associated with the merchant appears in scattered records generations afterward. The details are thin, but the outline remains. One commercial venture reached astonishing distance, and almost nothing comparable followed. The reason is simple. The window of opportunity slammed shut. Not long after Banchow retired, the political balance in the Tarim Basin shifted violently. Local kingdoms seized the moment to throw off Chinese officials, and the frontier that had been held together by one aging commander and his networks began to unravel. The Han court faced a grim calculation. Defending such remote territories meant long supply lines, dangerous travel, and constant risk for little immediate security at the heartland. The decision was to pull back, dismantling the formal structure that had governed the western regions. With that retreat, communication with Inner Asia weakened, and rival steppe powers moved quickly to fill the vacuum. Raids and instability followed for years. In practical terms, the route that might have carried direct overland contact between the Roman and Han worlds became unreliable, then nearly impossible. The two greatest empires of their age had come close to touching hands across the mountains, but the geography of power changed at exactly the wrong moment. While China's western link faltered, Rome was entering an era of bold expansion under a new emperor. Early in the 2nd century, Roman armies struck north of the Danube into Dacia and, after hard fighting, absorbed it as a province. Around the same period, Rome also tightened its grip over the eastern frontier by absorbing a client kingdom in Arabia into direct imperial rule. These were not small gestures. They signalled an emperor hungry for conquest and recognition, someone determined to outshine predecessors with victories that could be celebrated at the centre of the world. The celebrations for the Dacian victory became legendary. They lasted for many days, drew vast crowds, and displayed Rome's appetite for spectacle on a scale that stunned even seasoned observers. Foreign delegations were present, seated where they could be seen among the elite, and emissaries from India were singled out as especially notable. Their presence points to something deeper than curiosity. Rome's games depended on a steady stream of exotic animals and rare imports, and those supply chains ran through the east. When Roman agents appeared in distant markets demanding beasts and luxury goods, news travelled the same roads in reverse. Kings and merchants in faraway regions learned that a new ruler in the west was ambitious, wealthy, and eager to project power. In Central and South Asia, one rising empire had strong reasons to watch Rome's moves closely: the Kushans. By this time, they had become a major force, expanding across key corridors that linked the steppe, the Iranian plateau, and the Indian subcontinent. They had their own rivalries with Parthia, the power that sat between Rome and the east, and they had already shown they could play the long game of diplomacy and war along the caravan routes. Their court culture drew on many influences, including the legacy of Hellenic rule in parts of their territory. Greek language and classical motifs remained familiar in certain elite circles, and art from their heartlands could blend local religious themes with styles that felt surprisingly Mediterranean. That cultural overlap made the idea of contact with Rome easier to imagine, even if the political distances were immense. Kushan rulers also understood symbolism. They adopted foreign titles to project equality with other great monarchs, and they minted gold coins that echoed the look of Roman imperial issues. A bearded king might appear in local dress and helmet, surrounded by lettering shaped by Greek forms, while divinities from the region shared the same small circle of gold. Such objects suggest more than simple imitation. They hint at the prestige Rome carried in the eyes of distant powers, and at the way trade could carry not only goods, but ideas of authority. As the 2nd century progressed, Rome's attention turned ever more toward the east. The lure was not only glory, but also the wealth flowing along commercial routes. Roman leaders knew that precious metals left the empire in exchange for silks, spices, and luxuries, and some began to see the lands of Mesopotamia and beyond as both a strategic target and a prize. A conflict over Armenia offered the kind of crisis that an ambitious emperor could transform into a conquest. War against Parthia promised triumphs, titles, and the dream of pushing Roman power toward the edges of Asia. In the stories told later, the shadow of Alexander the Great often loomed behind these ambitions, the old model of a world conqueror tempting new rulers to attempt the same kind of reach. Yet even when Roman armies advanced, the farthest east remained more rumour than reality. Traders and geographers had heard of a great land at the edge of the world, sometimes named in ways that suggested a distant China. But early Roman mental maps still underestimated the size and power of that Eastern Empire. Some imagined Asia bending back toward the north, linking into steppe lands, leaving no clear place for a vast Chinese domain. Later, maritime reports added fragments of information, describing a major inland state associated with silk, but placing it vaguely at the outer fringe of the world. By the time the great mapmakers compiled their works, they had gathered more data from ocean routes and from rare overland journeys. Yet the picture remained incomplete. The city reached by the caravan from Mise was treated as the capital of the Silk people, not as the centre of a massive empire with its own politics and armies. For a long time, one brief note in the Han historical records has kept historians arguing and imagining, because it seems to describe a moment when people from the Roman world actually reached China and stood before a Han emperor. The report places this arrival in the year 166, during the reign of Emperor Huan, and it reads like the kind of event that should have changed everything. Yet the deeper the story is followed, the more it looks like an accident of trade and crisis, rather than a clean, deliberate meeting between two governments. The timing matters. In the middle of the 2nd century, a deadly illness was moving slowly along the networks that tied Eurasia together. As caravans and ships carried luxury goods, they also carried infection. One city after another in Central Asia would have suffered, and once those urban hubs weakened, the steady rhythm of overland commerce began to break down. Fewer caravans meant fewer profits, fewer taxes, and more pressure on rulers who depended on controlling key routes. In the Iranian world, this disruption likely encouraged a shift in strategy. If the inland roads became unreliable, then whoever controlled the remaining sea lanes and ports could still tap into the wealth that continued to flow by water. This shock would have been felt far beyond Iran. On India's western coast, trading kingdoms supplied Chinese silk to merchants who served Roman markets. But if the inland arteries linking Central Asia to the Indian Ocean began to fail, silk would have become harder to obtain in the usual way. Faced with shrinking supplies, traders and rulers had a reason to search for alternatives. One solution was to follow the sea. Maritime networks across Southeast Asia did not depend on the same vulnerable chain of inland cities, and those routes could still function even when the interior struggled. It is in this context that Chinese records begin to mention new visitors from Indian realms, arriving at the Han court in the late 150s and early 160s. These arrivals make sense as early attempts to secure fresh access to silk sources and to formalize relationships that could protect trade. Then the crisis sharpened further. In the early 160s, the disease reached Han forces posted on the western edges of the empire and spread quickly into the wider population. Almost at the same time, a major war erupted in the Near East, as Parthian armies pushed into Roman territory and fighting tore across Mesopotamia. The land routes around the Persian Gulf and the river valleys that supported commerce were suddenly threaded with armies. Overland movement became dangerous, slow, or impossible. When Roman troops campaigning in Mesopotamia began dying in large numbers from the same strange sickness, the pandemic had clearly reached the Mediterranean world as well. With the traditional channels strained or blocked, the Red Sea and Indian Ocean routes grew even more important for Roman merchants, trying to keep luxury goods flowing into their markets. In that atmosphere, any rumour of a workable sea passage toward the silk sources would have been irresistible. Roman traders who had dealings in Indian ports could have heard about voyages probing farther east, about contacts with coastal regions that had access to Chinese goods, and about a possibility, however uncertain, of reaching the edges of Han influence by ship. Out of that mix of desperation and opportunity, it is easy to picture an ambitious group putting a plan together. Not an imperial embassy marching under banners, but a merchant expedition hoping to open a new channel of profit and prestige. The sea route they would have followed was long and difficult. After moving along familiar waters, they would have pushed beyond the Malay Peninsula, threaded narrow straits, and sailed into the Gulf of Thailand. From there, heading north, they reached the coast of what is now northern Vietnam. In their minds, they may have believed they had reached the world they were looking for. They traded what they could, swapping Mediterranean goods for items available in the region that were associated with Eastern trade. But the place where they landed was not a distant neutral port. It was an area under Han military administration. Once local authorities realized foreigners from the far west had appeared, the visitors were taken into custody and forwarded inland. At the imperial court, everything would have been shaped by misunderstanding and by protocol. Language barriers alone would have been immense, and communication likely depended on a chain of interpreters, each one translating into a language that was not their own. The visitors apparently identified themselves as coming from the Roman world and claimed to have been sent by a ruler whose name, filtered through unfamiliar ears, was recorded in a shortened form. The Han record preserves the idea that this ruler was called Antun. It is tempting to connect that name to the Roman imperial title Antoninus, which was associated with the reigning emperor in that period. But even if the connection is real, the meaning remains uncertain. A merchant group could easily invoke a powerful name as a way to gain respect and safety, especially when moving through systems where official authority mattered. At the same time, the Han court could have interpreted the claim in the most formal way possible, because imperial bureaucracy preferred neat categories: envoys, tribute, submission. The gifts the Westerners presented added to the ambiguity. Rather than offering the kinds of rare, expensive objects expected from a great rival empire, they brought goods that looked ordinary by the standards of long-distance diplomacy. Items acquired in Southeast Asia, such as ivory, horn, and shell, could be valuable, but they were not the unmistakable signature of a state-backed mission from the Mediterranean. This mismatch created an awkward moment. Earlier information reaching China had painted the Roman world as wealthy and powerful. If an official embassy had arrived, it should have looked impressive. When it did not, Han officials had to choose an explanation. One option was that these visitors were not truly official. Another was that the stories about Rome had been exaggerated from the beginning. The record preserves that note of suspicion, implying that the tribute did not match the reputation. On the Roman side, the silence is just as revealing. Roman writers who describe the reign of Marcus Aurelius and the troubles of that era do not clearly record a triumphant return from China. No celebrated embassy, no formal treaty, no wave of new knowledge transforming imperial policy. Even if the travellers made it back, they would have returned to a world in chaos. The pandemic was cutting through cities and armies. The northern frontier was under pressure from large tribal coalitions. Resources were being pulled towards survival. Under those conditions, a distant contact at the far edge of the Indian Ocean would not have become a central priority for of the Roman state, and any commercial advantage might have been swallowed by the larger emergency. China, meanwhile, was facing its own disaster. Disease weakened garrisons and strained the machinery that held the empire together. Without clear understanding that the same calamity was battering Rome, Han officials may have interpreted the lack of follow-up in the simplest way. Perhaps the Western Empire was not as great as earlier reports had implied. Or perhaps it lacked the capacity to sustain long-distance relations. Either way, what looked at first like the beginning of direct connection turned into a single, puzzling episode. A story preserved because it was unusual, not because it reshaped policy. After that moment, the wider pattern moves toward decline and fragmentation. In times of fear and sickness, people often blame outsiders, and trade can become a target as much as a lifeline. In the Indian Ocean world, there are hints of violence against foreign shipping during this period, including raids, seizures of cargo, and hostages taken from Western crews. Whether driven by political calculation, economic opportunism, or simple hostility, such attacks would have made long voyages even more risky. At the same time, the old Roman dreams of conquering the East began to sound less like policy and more like fantasy. Satirists mocked grand promises of capturing Eastern kings, parading nobles, and marching Roman legions all the way to India. The gap between imperial propaganda and harsh reality was widening, and educated audiences were increasingly willing to laugh at stories that sounded too good to be true. That atmosphere helps explain why earlier reports of astonishing journeys toward the Far East did not trigger a wave of imitations. A merchant tale about reaching the heartland of the Silk people could be dismissed as exaggeration. Another traveller's boast, competing with a marketplace full of unbelievable claims. And even if some people believed it, the geopolitical landscape was getting worse. The regions between the Mediterranean and China were becoming more unstable. Wars, rebellions, and shifting dynasties made the long corridors less predictable. The route still existed in theory, but the confidence needed to invest in it was fading. Even so, the story does not end with complete silence. In the 3rd century, Chinese sources mention a few strange encounters with people described as coming from the Roman world. These incidents are scattered and hard to interpret, but they suggest that a small number of adventurous traders still knew the way across the seas, even as both ends of Eurasia were being shaken by civil conflict. China fractured after the fall of the Han, with rival states competing for supremacy. The Roman Empire also endured repeated internal crises, rapid changes of rulers, and renewed threats on multiple frontiers. Yet in the middle of that turbulence, a few individuals still tried to cross the ocean. One account speaks of a merchant arriving in eastern China in the 200s, reaching a southern court and being questioned about his homeland. The ruler, curious and pragmatic, used the opportunity to extract information about a faraway civilization that was rumored to be wealthy and sophisticated. The visitor offered descriptions of customs and geography, the kind of report a court could store as intelligence even if it never led to formal relations. A striking detail appears in this story as well. The visitor showed fascination with unusual captives at the court and was given a group of them as a gift. The Chinese ruler even assigned an officer to accompany the merchant back west, as if testing whether a real link could be created. But the officer died on the journey, and the sources do not describe a successful return. No clear Roman record celebrates a ship arriving with strange passengers from the far edge of the world. The simplest conclusion is that the voyage ended badly, swallowed by storms, disease, pirates, or the sheer cruelty of distance. Later references hint at renewed Roman commercial presence in Southeast Asia. By the 260s, improvements in Red Sea infrastructure point to a revival of long-range trade efforts, and Chinese texts note Roman merchants appearing in outer coastal regions, even if few people from those areas ever travelled all the way back to the Mediterranean. Archaeological finds, such as a Roman coin discovered far from the empire, support the idea that contact resumed in small, uneven pulses. Trade was not dead, but it had become thinner, more hazardous, and more dependent on local middlemen and shifting political conditions. In the same era, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East experienced dramatic upheaval. Persian power was reorganized under a new dynasty after the fall of the Parthians, and warfare in Iran disrupted the inland routes that had carried silk and other luxuries. Shortages and price rises in Roman markets would have pushed merchants to look again toward the sea route to reach the source regions. At the same time, the wealth of Eastern trade fueled the ambitions of powerful cities and local elites. Some Eastern leaders began to question why they should remain subordinate to distant emperors who taxed their profits while offering limited protection. This tension exploded in the rise of Palmyra, a city that transformed itself into a major military and commercial power on Rome's eastern frontier. As imperial authority weakened, Palmyra's leadership began to act like the center of a new Eastern empire. In Egypt, wealthy merchants with deep connections to Indian Ocean trade also had reasons to resent imperial control. Taxes siphoned off profits, and political instability in the wider empire made the relationship feel one-sided. In that environment, alliances formed that aimed at independence rather than loyalty. Roman sources later portrayed these figures in harsh, even grotesque terms as traitors and monsters. But behind the propaganda lay an economic reality. Control of Eastern commerce had become a political weapon. When Rome finally crushed these Eastern challengers, it did so brutally. Leaders were executed, cities punished, and captives from many distant regions were paraded as trophies. The spectacle itself reveals how wide the trade web still stretched. People connected to African kingdoms, Arabian polities, Central Asian powers, and Indian realms could be caught up in the fall of a commercial empire, seized not because they were soldiers, because they were part of the network that made the East profitable. The message was clear. The empire would tolerate trade, but not the political independence that trade wealth might buy. Ironically, the disruptions caused by renewed wars in Persia may have encouraged yet another attempt to reach China by sea in the early 280s. Chinese records from this period describe visitors from the Roman world arriving with unusual goods, including a fabric that could be cleaned by fire. The language of the account treats the arrival as tribute, but the details feel commercial rather than diplomatic. There is no clear sign of an emperor ordering a state mission. It reads more like private entrepreneurs testing a route, bringing whatever would impress local authorities and open doors for exchange. Soon after, another record describes a large offering of aromatic material in rolled form, likely acquired in Southeast Asia and prized in elite markets. The Chinese court responded by treating the material as valuable enough to be used for writing important texts, a gesture that turned a foreign gift into a symbol of cultural authority. For the merchants, the calculation would have been straightforward. Exchange a desirable commodity for silk and other luxury goods that would sell at high profit back in Western ports. But these late contacts came when both empires were already changing in ways that reduced the chance of meaningful, sustained connection. The Roman world was sliding into deeper monetary crisis. Coinage was steadily debased, prices rose, and the economic environment that once made long-distance trade wildly profitable became more difficult to manage. When the state tried to impose strict controls on prices, it further squeezed the space in which merchants could take the risks required for far ocean voyages. A trade venture to the edge of Asia demanded freedom to profit. Heavy-handed intervention made those ventures less attractive. The Roman Empire sits at the center of how the modern West imagines power, order, and civilization. Because of that, its politics, armies, and emperors have been studied endlessly. Yet one of the biggest questions still feels strangely slippery. How did this state actually pay for itself? The empire maintained professional legions across multiple frontiers, funded governors and officials, built roads and harbours, and kept huge cities functioning. But the machinery that supplied the money behind all of this is still debated. Some researchers emphasize taxes on land and people. Others focus on state property and monopolies, and many argue over how efficiently revenue was gathered and redistributed. What makes the puzzle more intriguing is how stable the early empire often appears compared with later European history. Medieval kingdoms in Western Europe rarely had the administrative reach, infrastructure, or steady financial base that Rome managed to sustain for long periods. It is only many centuries later, after overseas expansion and access to new resources, that European states began building systems that feel comparable in scale. That later revival is usually linked to global trade, especially the Indian Ocean and Asian commerce. But when it comes to Rome, the full weight of Eastern trade in the imperial story has often been treated as a side topic, rather than a central pillar, and yet the evidence suggests that Eastern imports were not a curiosity at the edge of the economy. They were woven into daily life, medicine, worship, fashion, and government finance. In the Roman world, one city stands out as the main hinge between the Mediterranean and the wider Indian Ocean system: Alexandria. It was not simply a large port, but a massive meeting point where people, ships, goods, and languages collided. From there, merchandise moved onward into Italy, the Aegean, North Africa, and the western provinces. Alexandria's role was strengthened by geography and by state policy. It had access to the Nile and to the Red Sea corridor. It was also tied to Rome by grain, because the food supply of the capital depended heavily on Egypt. Those two forces together created a powerful commercial magnet. Once a trade stream concentrates in one place, it tends to reinforce itself. Merchants cluster there, shipping grows, storage expands, contracts multiply, and the city becomes not just a stop on the route, but the route's controlling centre. The scale of traffic moving through Egypt could be enormous. Contemporary observers describe fleets sailing from Red Sea ports toward Arabia, East Africa, and India. Even if the numbers are treated cautiously, the basic point remains. Rome was not dealing with a handful of exotic shipments. It was receiving a steady flow of cargo that, over time, amounted to truly industrial quantities. Spices, aromatics, textiles, gems, ivory, and countless smaller goods poured into warehouses, markets, and workshops. Much of this left almost no archaeological footprint in the places where it was consumed. Because spices are eaten or burned, perfumes evaporate, cloth decays, and gems are recycled. That is why the most vivid physical evidence often comes from the desert ports themselves. Along Egypt's Red Sea coast, harsh conditions preserved what most Roman sites could never keep: seeds, husks, shells, burnt offerings, food scraps, even the remains of cargo spilled and swept into rubbish dumps. Archaeologists working at these ports have found large quantities of black pepper, far beyond what would be expected if it were only a rare luxury handled occasionally. Pepper appears not just in storage areas, but in everyday waste, suggesting it was present in the working life of the port. Some pepper seems to have been burned in a religious context, mixed into offerings at sanctuaries. The finds also include rice remains, which fits the idea of imported food used for specific diets and medicinal preparations, but also carried by visiting traders as familiar staples. Coconut fragments appear as well, consistent with multiple uses, as food, as oil, and even as practical supplies for ships, since certain oils could be used to protect ropes and rigging on long voyages. Mung beans and other nutrient-rich plants show up too, and these kinds of foods make sense as portable, sustaining supplies for travellers who had to endure months at sea. Even dried fruit remains linked to distant Asian regions, suggest that seafarers and merchants understood the health risks of long voyages and tried to protect themselves with foods that helped prevent deficiency and illness. Physical finds tell one part of the story. Written records show another, the sheer diversity of imported goods that passed into Roman hands. Lists of taxed commodities preserved from Egypt reveal a world of imports that ranges far beyond a simple image of silk and spices. The catalogue includes dozens of aromatics, resins, barks, and roots used for incense, medicine, perfumes, and flavoured drinks. It includes precious stones and pearls, ivory, hides and specialty leathers, textiles, dyes, and even living cargo such as exotic animals. Some entries point to India, others to Arabia, East Africa, or the Persian Gulf, and some clearly reflect contact with regions under Iranian control. What matters is not only variety, but the fact that these goods were taxed and recorded. A system does not bother listing and taxing items that arrive rarely. Lists like these imply volume, repetition, and routine. Price information from Roman writers suggests something else. Many Eastern products were not restricted to emperors and senators. Even when cheap spices still cost days of wages for a labourer, purchases could be small and occasional. A household might buy a tiny amount of incense for a shrine, a pinch of pepper for a dish, or a little resin for a special ceremony. Multiply that behaviour across millions of people, year after year, and a massive market appears. That is the quiet engine of long-distance trade. Not only elite consumption, but the combined effect of countless minor purchases, made by ordinary households, trying to improve food, health, and daily life. Pepper is a perfect example because it sits at the intersection of taste, preservation, medicine, and fashion. In Roman cooking, it became a standard flavouring, used in sauces, mixed into dressings, paired with seafood, meat, and wine. It could be added in small amounts to transform a dish and make food more appealing for longer, which mattered in crowded cities, where freshness was always a challenge. The spice also became a symbol of how far Roman commerce reached. Moral writers marvelled and complained that people were willing to haul a pungent berry from the other side of the world simply to change the taste of Mediterranean meals. Satirists pushed the idea further, making fun of merchants and hosts who seemed to chase novelty for its own sake. But mockery itself is revealing. People do not ridicule a habit that is rare. They ridicule what has become common enough to notice. Because the state controlled customs and taxation, government institutions also had direct access to Eastern goods. In Egypt, imports could be taxed at a significant rate, giving the authorities large quantities of spices and aromatics in kind or in cash. These supplies were not merely sold off immediately. Eastern products had practical importance to the state. Aromatics were needed for public ceremonies, games, processions, and religious life. Ingredients were needed for medicines used by households, doctors, and the military. Over time, that demand encouraged central storage on a huge scale. In Rome itself, dedicated warehouses were built for spices and incense, close to the heart of the city, not tucked away like a minor commercial warehouse district. These complexes were structured for bulk, handling, and redistribution, with storage rooms, courtyards used for sale or issue, and water systems that helped manage the stifling atmosphere created by concentrated aromatics. The very existence of such infrastructure suggests that Eastern goods were not an occasional luxury. They were a managed resource. Archaeology and scattered written records show how widely these imports spread. Pepper remains and pepper-related objects appear far from the warm ports where they entered the empire. Evidence reaches into quarries in Egypt's desert, into towns in Gaul, into Italian cities, and even into military sites on the cold northern frontiers. Supplies of pepper appear in documents linked to soldiers in Britain near Hadrian's Wall, showing that Eastern commodities were travelling not just to fashionable urban elites, but to garrisons at the edge of Roman power. That kind of distribution requires networks, middlemen, storage, and predictable routes. It also suggests demand among people who were not living in luxury, but still valued taste, medicine, and status markers. Medicine was another major driver. Roman healing relied heavily on plant substances, resins, and aromatics, and many of the most prized ingredients came from the East. Myrrh and frankincense appear repeatedly in remedies for pain, inflammation, and infections. Oils and resins were used in eye treatments, digestive medicines, tonics, and salves. The medical trade itself was widespread, which can be seen in small containers and specialist tools found across the provinces. Eye medicine, in particular, created a visible signature in archaeology, stamped markers of practitioners whose products circulated across northwest Europe. The point is not that every Roman was constantly consuming exotic medicine, but that Eastern ingredients became woven into routine health practices in a way that made them commercially significant. Incense may have mattered even more because it combined religion and daily life. Roman cities were crowded and often foul-smelling. Incense and scented woods helped mask odours in homes, public buildings, and streets. But beyond practicality, incense was central to ritual. Temples, household shrines, festivals, triumphs, and processions. It was burned in great quantities in public ceremonies and in private devotion. It was also used in funerary rites, where it honoured the dead and softened the harsh sensory reality of cremation. A small household shopping list from an Italian city gives a telling glimpse. Alongside basic foods, the list includes a little incense, cheap enough to be bought routinely. That single detail implies a regular access and ordinary use, not rare extravagance. Yet incense and perfume also exposed Roman moral anxieties. The same substances needed for worship and medicine could be used for personal display. Perfumed oils became fashionable, first among the wealthy and then across broader sections of society. Writers complain about men drenched in scent, about hair oils that announce someone's presence across an entire theatre, about rooms perfumed to disguise other smells. These complaints often sound exaggerated, but they signal that perfumes had become visible, common, and socially charged. Even soldiers, who were supposed to embody discipline and simplicity, began using perfumed oils, which shocked traditionalists. Stories circulate about stern emperors reacting with disgust toward officers who smelled too sweet, preferring the rough scent of garlic and sweat to imported fragrance. The underlying tension was cultural. Eastern luxuries were admired, needed, and desired, but also feared as symbols of softness and moral decline. Perfume also became a field where money could hide. Because aromatic oils were expensive and hard to measure precisely, they could be used as a convenient label in financial records. A large sum could be disguised under perfumes without immediately raising suspicion, because everyone knew perfumes could be wildly costly and fleeting. This hints at how deeply the trade in aromatics and luxury goods had entered the everyday reality of elite accounting and corruption. Eastern imports shaped Roman dining beyond pepper as well. Spices and resins were mixed into wine, creating fashionable flavoured drinks that appealed to taste and status. Wealthy consumers experimented with aromatics in oil and food, and the range of available flavours could be astonishing. One shipwreck off Italy preserved a dramatic snapshot of this world. Containers filled with carefully packed spice samples, whose scents still lingered when opened by modern investigators. The collection included multiple exotic flavourings, arranged like a merchant's portable showroom. It is a vivid reminder that spice trade was not an abstract economic theme, but a tactile, sensory business. If spices and aromatics transformed taste and ritual, textiles transformed appearance. Chinese silk entered the Roman world as a luxury, but it did not remain a single elite novelty. Roman workshops developed ways to rework imported silk into lighter, more delicate fabrics, and eventually into translucent materials that clung and draped in ways linen could not. Early on, such fabrics were associated with entertainers and sex workers, precisely because the cloth could reveal the body. But fashion rarely stays in one social category. The appeal of silk, especially in heat, spread outward. Respectable women began using silk in ways that stayed within traditional garment forms, while still hinting at the body beneath. Silk became linked to elegance, comfort, and allure. Accessories followed: parasols, scarves, and thin coloured fabrics that caught light and shimmered in vivid dyes. This created a predictable backlash. Moralists attacked silk as a symbol of vanity and foreign influence, claiming it undermined modesty and tradition. Senators debated restrictions, and laws were passed to limit silk use among elite men, partly to curb political extravagance and partly because silk was associated with femininity and softness. But fashion is hard to police. Emperors themselves could ignore such rules, and once a trend becomes embedded in comfort and status, enforcement collapses. Over time, silk became common in elite male clothing as well, not as translucent fabric, but as fine opaque strips, edgings, and coloured accents that signalled wealth without breaking masculine norms too openly. Roman writers grumbled that the old, heavy clothing of earlier generations was being replaced by garments so light that even a toga was starting to feel like a burden. Physical traces of silk survive only rarely, but when they do appear, they show remarkable reach. Silk fragments have been found in places far from Egypt, including tomb contexts and distant provinces. Images in wall paintings suggest the popularity of delicate draped fabrics among wealthy women in Italian cities. Even in the far north, silk had a practical role in military display. Lightweight fabric was ideal for banners, and bright dyes made standards visible in wind and rain. Records and inscriptions hint at merchants from eastern cities living in distant provinces and supplying such materials to frontier units, suggesting that trade diaspora communities carried their networks to the edge of the empire. Jewellery completed the picture. Pearls and gemstones from the east became a powerful form of status display. Shops in central Rome offered such items to buyers who wanted to announce wealth in the most visible way possible. Writers describe customers inspecting stones, comparing quality, and worrying about imitation goods. This world of luxury retail mattered economically because it turned distant trade into domestic fashion. The demand was not abstract. It was driven by people walking through markets, choosing what to wear, what to burn in a shrine, what to sprinkle into a sauce, and what to place in a perfume bottle. Roman society in the early empire developed a sharp eye for display. Wealth was no longer shown only through land or political rank, but through objects that could be worn, carried, set on a table, or unveiled at a banquet. The more competitive elite life became, the more inventive Romans grew in turning luxury into a public performance. Imported stones, perfumes, fabrics, rare woods, ivory, and even living curiosities from the East were pulled into this culture of visibility. Over time, these imports stopped being occasional novelties and became part of a recognizable style, a look that signaled status before a single word was spoken. Among wealthy men, gemstones became a particularly clear marker. Signet rings were practical tools for sealing documents, but they also acted like portable billboards of wealth. Rings could hold carved stones, polished and engraved, and a single hand might carry a small fortune. Writers of the age describe men wearing multiple stones at once, mixing different colours and types to show variety as well as cost. Some of the stones circulating in Roman jewellery were sourced from the Indian Ocean world, and certain varieties became fashionable enough to be noticed across the empire. Even in death, the message of luxury was sometimes maintained. Burials and cremations could include rings still on the fingers, as if the jewellery were part of the person's public identity and could not be separated from it. Luxury display did not stop at what could be worn. The banquet table became a stage for expensive materials, and a new kind of obsession grew around vessels and ornaments made from exotic stone. One mineral in particular attracted intense interest, because it looked like glass but carried the authority of rarity. A translucent stone imported from the Iranian world that could be shaped into cups, ladles, and small tableware. Its appeal came from appearance as much as from cost. It could show bands of colour, shifting from purples and blues to smoky blacks and warm reds. Some pieces were prized for patterns that looked almost painted inside the stone. In certain light, the surface could seem to glow softly, giving the impression of a living material rather than a carved object. Hosts used these vessels to impress guests, and the value placed on them became so extreme that single pieces could be purchased, for sums that would have funded estates. Stories circulated about men damaging such cups through nervous habits, even chewing at the rim, and yet still watching the item rise in value because fashion was driving demand faster than supply. As the trend spread, the stones moved beyond cups themselves and began to appear as decoration on banquetware. Gem-studded drinking vessels became a way to announce status without even speaking. A host could hold a cup that glittered with inlaid stones, while guests drank from plainer metal or ceramic. In some houses, expensive gems that would normally sit on rings were set into tableware instead, turning the act of drinking into a display of ownership. This created its own social friction. Satirists describe wealthy patrons guarding their gold and gems, even while pretending to be generous, watching guests closely as if the dinner were a test of honesty. The humour only works because the behaviour was familiar. Luxury had become common enough to be criticised, and envy had become common enough to be assumed. If elite men used gems for public competition, elite women turned jewellery into a language of fashion. Pearls and coloured stones became more than accessories. They were statements of rank, desirability, and confidence. At first, the largest pearls and the richest stones were confined to the top of society. But the trend did what trends often do. It filtered downward. People with moderate means began trying to imitate the elite look, buying smaller pearls, fewer stones, or cheaper substitutes, because appearing in public without the expected ornaments began to feel like being underdressed. By this point, jewellery was not simply decoration. It could function like an escort in visual form, announcing importance before servants or guards even appeared. Pearls became the centre of this fashion because they could be worn in ways that created movement and sound. Women did not always wear a single pearl per ear. Multiple pearls were hung together, sometimes layered so that they swung and knocked gently against each other. The effect was theatrical, a shimmer in the light and a faint rattle with every step, turning jewellery into a kind of performance. Critics complained that this was not refinement, but a competition of fortunes, as if ears had been trained to carry weight like pack animals. Moralists linked the obsession to social decay, arguing that the hunger for gems revealed a society that valued appearance over character. Religious leaders in the eastern provinces also pushed back, urging modest dress and warning communities not to turn worship into a contest of gold, pearls, and costly clothing. The criticism did not slow the fashion. Writers describe wealthy women trying to outdo rivals by layering pearls on fingers, ears, neck, and hair, building a display that covered the body in expensive points of light. Some people pushed it further by attaching pearls to footwear, turning even steps into a form of advertising. The message was obvious. Wealth could be worn everywhere, even in places no one needed to decorate. In the most extreme cases, jewellery was treated almost like an investment portfolio. A woman could carry a fortune on her body and, if challenged, prove its price through receipts and documentation. This was display taken to its logical endpoint, not just wearing wealth, but verifying it, as if status were a transaction that demanded proof. These ornaments were not limited to Rome. In wealthy eastern cities under Roman influence, funerary sculptures show women depicted with heavy necklaces, pearl earrings, and gemstone ornaments, suggesting that the style travelled with the trade routes and with the diaspora communities who profited from them. In Egypt, painted portraits on coffins show the same emphasis on jewellery, with pearls arranged in chokers, long loops and complex earrings, held by twisted threads of gold. Such images do not merely show personal taste, they reflect a broader market. For every pearl worn in public, there were merchants importing it, craftsmen drilling and setting it, goldsmiths shaping the wire, and retailers displaying it behind counters. The fashion created work, and work created profit, which fed back into the appetite for display. This Eastern look was not built from jewellery alone. Perfumes, hair oils, and imported scents completed the image. Hair was styled with scented oils that gave gloss and fragrance, and elaborate curls and waves became part of the ideal appearance. Extensions were used to create volume and height, and imported hair became a commodity in its own right. The result was a beauty culture that depended on foreign supply chains. Accessories matched the trend. Hairpins, fasteners, and combs could be ornamented with stones, so that even a hairstyle could sparkle. A woman's appearance became a carefully assembled set of signals: scent, shine, colour, cloth, and gems working together. Fabrics played their role too. Fine silks, especially in bright colours, turned clothing into a form of movement and light. Jewellery looked different against silk, and perfume felt more luxurious when paired with cloth that draped elegantly. Writers describe an ideal mistress being associated with matching stones, green gems, costly scents, and the finest fabrics available in the city's luxury markets. Others dramatize the opposite, portraying a woman rejecting scarlet dyes, silk, heavy pearls, and foreign perfume in favour of simplicity. The contrast itself shows how clearly the public recognized the style. It had become a social category. The fashionable look versus the deliberately plain look. Alongside wearable luxuries, wealthy Romans developed a taste for crafted objects made from exotic materials. Houses and villas displayed furniture built from dark, imported woods, sometimes inlaid with ivory or decorated with polished shell. Dining couches, beds, doors and sideboards could be made from rare timber, and the material became synonymous with refined taste. In the most expensive shops, buyers would inspect tables of different shapes and sizes, measure couches as if preparing to host the perfect dinner, and examine decorative ornaments displayed on higher shelves like trophies. Even those who could not afford the items liked to browse because looking itself became part of the culture of luxury. The marketplace was a theatre, and the audience included the poor as well as the rich. Some poets imagined the countryside as a moral alternative to this urban obsession. In those idealized rural scenes, there were no doorposts decorated with shell, no gold-threaded garments, no foreign dyes staining wool, and no exotic spices flavoring everyday oil. The list of absences is revealing, because it shows what the city was assumed to contain. Urban life meant imported colour, scent, and material. Rural life was framed as plain by comparison, even if the reality was more complex. Eastern materials also appeared in smaller personal objects. Shell could be used for combs and brushes. Horn might be shaped into polished containers for oil in public baths. Ivory, in particular, became a favourite for decoration and craftwork. It was used in furniture, boxes, writing tablets, medical tools, gaming pieces, ornaments, and even dental fittings. Some ivory pieces circulating in Italy were likely brought as finished craftwork from the Indian Ocean world, not merely raw tusk. One famous type of find is a delicate carved female figure discovered in the ruins of a wealthy town, a reminder that the Roman taste for exotic artistry could bring foreign motifs into private rooms as prized possessions. Luxury in Rome was not limited to objects. People could be imported too. Exotic slaves were a status symbol, selected to serve at banquets precisely because their appearance, language, or origin could impress guests. Some were renamed with foreign place names, turning their identity into another display item in the household. Certain categories of slaves, especially eunuchs, commanded astonishing prices. The presence of such servants was part of the same logic that drove jewellery and silk. The household became a curated exhibit of distance and wealth. Even emperors who criticised extravagance found it difficult to reverse because luxury had become tied to social competition and political ambition. Animals completed the spectacle. The elite kept exotic birds as pets, especially those that could mimic human speech. A talking parrot from India could be treated like a rare gift from the edge of the world, mourned when it died, and remembered as a symbol of the household's sophistication. In public entertainment, larger animals arrived in large numbers. Exotic beasts were showcased in hunts and staged fights in arenas, where the sheer presence of a rare animal signalled the organisers' resources and reach. Tigers, rhinos, and imported big cats became part of mass spectacle, and the supply chain that brought them was an extension of the same maritime commerce that brought spices and pearls. By the end of the early imperial period, the sums being poured into luxury consumption could be staggering. Wealth could vanish quickly when it was spent on fashion, banquets, and display objects rather than land or productive investment. Even when the state tried to claw back gifts and fortunes, it often found that little remained, because money had been converted into extravagance and then consumed, broken, burned, or scattered. Some emperors publicly disapproved of excessive luxury and tried to restrain it through personal example and social pressure. But trends driven by status competition are resilient. The appetite for Eastern goods and for what they symbolized continued into later decades. Trade did not fade simply because moralists complained. As long as Roman society rewarded visible wealth, the market for the scents, stones, fabrics, and crafted wonders of the East remained strong. Eastern commerce did more than move cargo. Over time, it moved people. As ships and caravans connected the Mediterranean to Arabia, East Africa, Persia, and India, the Roman world began to absorb visitors, workers, and settlers from places that many Italians would have imagined only as distant names. Nowhere showed this more clearly than Egypt. Alexandria, with its harbours and marketplaces, did not feel like a provincial city at the edge of an empire. It felt like a crossroads, where languages overlapped and unfamiliar clothes, accents, and customs could appear in the same street on the same afternoon. Contemporary observers described theatre crowds that did not consist only of locals or nearby neighbours. Greeks and Italians sat alongside Syrians and North Africans, while people from even farther away could be spotted in the same rows. Ethiopians, Arabs, Persians, steppe peoples, and a small number of Indians. In a place like that, foreign presence was not an occasional spectacle. It was part of the social fabric. This international reality extended beyond Egypt. Merchant communities from the eastern provinces established themselves in Italy's commercial ports, using warehouses and dock facilities to manage the flood of goods coming in from the Red Sea and beyond. Traders from Arabia built practical networks for storage and distribution at key harbours, while Syrians from Oasis cities, famous for long-distance trade, also operated within Rome itself. Inscriptions hint at organised groups with enough money and confidence to build sanctuaries to their own gods, even in the capital. The movement of people followed the movement of profits. Once the routes became predictable and the margins became attractive, residency and long-term settlement became rational choices rather than daring adventures. The reach of these networks could stretch astonishingly far. Along the empire's northern frontier in Britain, far from the warmth of the eastern Mediterranean, traders with roots in Syria appear in the evidence. One of the most striking traces comes from a tombstone that commemorates a woman whose life connects multiple worlds. She is presented as a freedwoman and wife of a man from Palmyra. Yet she herself was born among a British tribe and died young. The inscription records both identities, as though the marriage joined not only two people, but two regions. The same husband is linked with supplying silk standards or banners to nearby military units, a reminder that luxury goods and foreign materials could be drawn into practical frontier life. At the edge of the empire, soldiers guarded walls and roads, yet imported textiles could still fly in the wind above a garrison. Behind the stories of travellers and residents stood a harder question: how all of this was financed. Long-distance commerce required capital on a scale that most individuals could not casually raise. A single expedition to India or the southern Arabian coast demanded large sums before a profit could even be imagined. Ships had to be hired or owned, crews paid, cargo purchased, and losses anticipated. Risk was unavoidable. Storms, piracy, shipwreck, disease, war, and political disruption could erase an investment overnight. Because of this, the most successful participants were rarely lone adventurers. They were organisers who understood partnerships, credit, and diversification. One Italian family's rise illustrates how ordinary commerce could evolve into participation in the Eastern trade. Their earlier activities appear tied to shipping and staple goods in the Mediterranean world, the kind of business that moved wine, grain, and other bulk cargo between familiar ports. Names appear on containers and equipment, suggesting a steady involvement in export and transport. Over time, members of the family show up in contexts linked with the desert routes and Red Sea ports that served the Indian Ocean trade. Such traces imply a gradual expansion rather than a sudden leap. The family did not begin as exotic merchants chasing distant luxuries. They began as practical shippers and traders, and then followed opportunity outward as the system matured. Evidence from contracts and business habits points to a common method for handling the costs and dangers of these ventures: small consortiums. Instead of one person staking everything on a single ship, several partners would combine resources. 4 or 5 investors might fund a venture together, dividing costs and dividing returns. This arrangement also reduced personal catastrophe if a vessel never returned. A diversified investor could spread money across several expeditions, holding partial shares in multiple cargoes rather than betting a fortune on one hull. Even people with limited means could sometimes participate by renting a small section of cargo space on a large freighter, travelling with the expedition and filling that space with goods chosen for resale back in Roman markets. That practice widened participation and created a layered economy. Major backers at the top, smaller traders beneath them, and agents and contractors tying everything together. Alexandria was uniquely suited to produce this kind of capital. The city did not rely on distant trade alone. It also sat at the heart of the grain system that fed the imperial centre. Large-scale grain shipping generated serious profit, and repeated transactions on that scale meant that a pool of money existed in Egypt that could be redirected into riskier, higher-yield ventures. In effect, the predictable business of provisioning could underwrite the gamble of the Indian Ocean. Some merchants built their war chests by moving through Mediterranean ports, buying and selling along coastlines to accumulate the funds needed for a single grand expedition. Others approached the problem differently, using credit and the promise of future sales to secure loans, then repaying lenders from the proceeds of the returning cargo. The Roman state was not a passive observer in this system. It imposed heavy charges on imports entering through key entry points, taking a substantial share of the value at the moment goods arrived from the sea. This levy could be the largest single cost attached to Eastern commerce, and it meant that profitable trade was entangled with government finance at the most basic level. When a ship returned loaded with pepper, aromatics, fine textiles, gemstones, ivory, and other high-value items, a quarter of that wealth could effectively be claimed at the border. Payment did not necessarily have to be made in one simple way. Importers could settle in cash by borrowing against the cargo, using the goods as security. Another possibility is that the state accepted payment in kind, taking physical merchandise instead of coin. In that scenario, imperial agents could sell those goods later or release them back into the market through controlled channels. Either way, the system ensured that the government profited directly from the commerce that private merchants risked their lives and fortunes to sustain. The returns could be spectacular. A single successful voyage could bring in sums that rivaled or exceeded the property threshold associated with elite status. Partners who shared one ship's cargo could each walk away with enough money to fund independent ventures, become lenders themselves, or buy land and reposition their wealth into the traditional forms of security and prestige. Some individuals expanded their role from trader to financier, offering startup capital to newcomers, funding multiple ships, and hiring agents to operate in different ports. The pattern is visible in scattered references to ship-owning entrepreneurs, and even wealthy women who appear as managers and investors in fleets, not merely as passive holders of property. The trade created space for a commercially grounded elite, whose social weight came less from ancestry and more from cash flow. This emerging business class did not always fit comfortably into aristocratic ideals. Old elites valued land, lineage, and a specific public style. The new millionaires often came from modest backgrounds and carried the habits of commerce into their self-presentation. Satire captured this tension by portraying boastful, self-made men who spoke openly about risk, disaster, and relentless rebuilding. The image is exaggerated for effect, yet it reflects something real. Big money could be made quickly, lost quickly, and remade quickly in the world of ships. In those stories, a fortune might be swallowed by the sea in a single season, and the response would be to build again, larger and bolder, as though the loss was simply the cost of playing at the highest level. Such figures also reveal a deeper truth about ambition. Once profits rose high enough, many traders tried to convert unstable commercial gains into stable social security. They bought estates, acquired property, and shifted into lending, turning themselves into local powers even if their origins were humble. Large-scale Eastern commerce depended on networks that reached across the Mediterranean. Successful merchants needed agents in major ports to source export goods for the outward journey and to distribute imports on return. Certain types of coin had to be gathered deliberately for export eastward, especially if foreign markets preferred specific issues. Bulk products like cheap wine had to be bought in quantity, transported to staging points, and forwarded to the Red Sea. On the return route, the distribution problem reversed. Perfumes, spices, gemstones, silks, and exotic items had to move from Egypt into Italy and other provinces through wholesalers, retailers, and specialized craftsmen. The merchant at the center of such a system was less a lone traveler and more a coordinator of many moving parts. Some families blurred the line between private enterprise and public finance. Certain entrepreneurs not only organized trade, but also purchased tax collection contracts, effectively operating as financial partners of the state. Their freedmen and agents appear in inscriptions and roadside markers, revealing people who traveled frequently between Nile cities, desert roads, and ports. The same business structures that supported trade could also support the collection of customs revenue. On occasion, a routine voyage could turn into an accidental voyage of discovery when a ship was blown off course and reached unexpected shores. Such events show how the machinery of trade exposed Roman agents to parts of the world that official politics rarely touched. Among the most revealing figures in this environment are wealthy Alexandrians who combined local influence, Roman citizenship, and deep integration into the customs system. One family stands out because it connects fiscal authority with private profit on an impressive scale. The father held a powerful role tied to customs revenues in the Eastern Desert, a position that could generate immense wealth and foster close relationships with imperial circles. That access and money could then be used to establish a son as a major operator in Red Sea commerce. Archives of business documents show agents stationed at crucial points, linking Nile transport to desert crossings and harbour departures. Such a system required more than capital. It required trust, administration, and the ability to enforce agreements across long distances. The son's marriage into a royal Eastern family suggests that commerce and elite politics were not separate worlds. They could intersect through alliances, credit, and shared interest. The political careers of relatives in that family underline the same point. Administrative office in Egypt and Judea, military command, and eventual high authority in Alexandria demonstrate how a household could move between trade, taxation, and imperial power. When civil war shook the empire, figures with control over Egypt's wealth and logistics could influence the outcome. Grain supply and revenue streams were strategic weapons, and the people who managed them were not merely bureaucrats. They were kingmakers. With such stakes, the value of Eastern trade was not simply a matter of curiosity. Some Roman writers claimed that enormous sums of precious metal flowed out of the empire each year toward Arabia, India, and the distant silk-producing lands beyond. In that view, luxury consumption was not only a moral problem, but a fiscal drain, a steady leak of bullion in exchange for goods that were then sold at huge markups in Roman markets. These claims were often framed as criticism, blaming desire for foreign luxuries and the appetites of the wealthy. Yet the same numbers, if taken seriously, imply something else. Eastern trade was one of the largest profit engines in the Roman economy, because goods bought abroad could be sold in the Mediterranean at many times their acquisition value. The structure of the trade helps explain those profits. In some Eastern markets, Roman money could purchase spices, textiles, gemstones, and aromatics cheaply compared with the prices those items commanded in Rome. Roman merchants did not necessarily need 100-fold gain on every product for the system to be transformative. A 10-fold return across repeated voyages would already generate fortunes. Multiple layers of profit also existed. Even before goods reached Italy, the cargo could change value through handling, sorting, and packaging in Egyptian hubs. Then, in the largest markets, prices rose again through retail distribution. Processing was one of the most important engines of added value. Some imported products arrived in raw form and were transformed into higher-priced commodities through labour and expertise. Incense and aromatics were not always sold exactly as they arrived. In large workshops, they could be cleaned, sorted, blended, and prepared to meet Roman standards and fashions. The value of such goods made theft a constant fear, and accounts describe strict security, controlled access, sealed work clothing, head coverings, and inspections before workers left the premises. These measures make sense in a world where a handful of resin could be worth more than a labourer's weekly pay. Textiles show an even clearer pattern. Silks arriving from the east were not always suited to Roman taste. In Mediterranean workshops, thicker cloth could be unravelled and rewoven into lighter, more delicate fabrics, including translucent weaves that became fashionable in elite circles. This was not a small adjustment. It was a fundamental transformation of the material. The same imported silk could be made into entirely different products, and each stage of labour could multiply the sale price. Dyes increased value even further, especially when expensive purple shades were applied. By the time a finished garment reached an urban consumer, the price might be vastly higher than the cost of the raw cloth at its origin. From the perspective of critics, this looked like a scandalous waste. From the perspective of merchants and manufacturers, it looked like a supply chain designed to print money. A similar logic operated in perfumery. Raw imports, such as nard and other aromatics, could be turned into concentrated oils and then blended into costly fragrances. The yield from natural plant material was limited, and the process required knowledge, equipment, and time. Once oils were produced, they were diluted with carriers and combined with other scents to create products that appealed to Roman taste. The result was a price ladder. Raw leaf at one price, extracted oil at a higher one, finished perfume at higher still. Religious and social demand helped stabilize the market. Even when moralists complained about vanity, public ceremony and private habit kept the appetite alive. Price escalation did not occur only in Rome. Ancient administrators in China also recognized that foreign imports could become vastly more expensive by the time they reached the imperial center. Distance, transport costs, labor, risk, and the number of intermediaries all worked together to create astonishing markups. In any large empire, the farthest goods carried an aura of rarity, and rarity itself was a form of value. Taken as a whole, the economic picture is striking. Eastern imports entered the Roman world at immense value, paid a major share to the state at the border, were processed and transformed in manufacturing centres, and then sold across the empire at prices that could multiply their original cost many times over. In monetary terms, this could mean that a stream of exported bullion generated a vastly larger stream of retail commerce inside Roman territory. The trade, therefore, mattered not only to elite consumers chasing exotic pleasure, but to the broader economy that profited from transport, warehousing, processing, manufacture, retail, and tax revenue. Spices and silk were not just luxuries at the end of the chain. They were part of a system that connected distant labour and distant landscapes to the daily business of imperial finance, urban industry, and social ambition. The flow of luxury goods from the East into the Roman world was never just a matter of ships and markets. It was also a matter of taxation. Every stage of the journey generated revenue for the Roman state. When cargoes from Arabia, India, and beyond arrived at Egyptian Red Sea ports, officials assessed their value and imposed heavy customs charges before the goods could move any farther. When those same items were forwarded from Egypt toward Mediterranean destinations, they were taxed again. The system worked in both directions. Merchandise sent outward from the Mediterranean toward the Indian Ocean also faced repeated duties along the route. Goods entering Alexandria paid one charge, and when they continued inland toward desert routes and eastern ports, another was collected. High-value cargo attracted especially high rates. The structure ensured that the most profitable goods were also the most heavily taxed. These frontier customs were often calculated as a substantial fraction of the cargo's declared value. When applied to the enormous scale of Eastern trade, the result was staggering. Shipments heading toward India and Arabia in a single year could be worth well over 100 million sesterces, and taxing them at frontier rates alone produced tens of millions for the treasury. The return flow of spices, textiles, gemstones, aromatics, and other imports was valued at many times that figure. Duties imposed at entry points could therefore produce hundreds of millions more. Afterward, when these goods left Alexandria for other Mediterranean ports, smaller port taxes were added again. Each harbour authority collected its share. By the time Eastern cargo reached final markets, it had contributed repeatedly to imperial income. Egypt's customs network became one of the most efficient revenue engines in the Roman world. This stream of commercial tax mattered because most Roman provinces were not major profit centres for the central government. Conquest itself could be lucrative at first. Victories produced plunder, tribute, and new openings for private enrichment. Military commanders and political elites often grew rich from campaigns. But once a region was absorbed into the empire, the financial picture changed. Garrisons had to be paid, roads maintained, officials supported, and defences funded year after year. In many territories, these continuing costs consumed most of the taxes collected locally. Some frontier zones, especially in the north, required more money to defend than they produced in revenue. Even when such regions were strategically important, they were financial burdens. Roman leaders sometimes admitted this reality openly, acknowledging that certain subject lands were held for security or prestige rather than profit. Only a few areas stood out as strongly revenue positive. Parts of Asia Minor were famous for their agricultural richness and export capacity, and they delivered dependable income. By contrast, northern expansions along the Rhine and Danube improved security but drained the treasury. Even the later conquest of Britain, though politically dramatic, was widely understood to be a poor financial bargain. Trade taxes on goods moving between Britain and the continent could bring in more money than direct rule. Yet political motives, military pride, and imperial image often outweighed strict economic logic. Rome sometimes kept what it could not profitably afford, simply because abandoning it would signal weakness. In provinces where costs were lower, surplus funds were often reinvested locally in infrastructure such as aqueducts and public buildings. This practice reinforced loyalty and stability, but limited how much cash flowed back to the capital. For many regions, tribute sent to Rome functioned more as a symbol of submission than a major budget contribution. Against this background, the income generated through Eastern commerce stands out sharply. Taxes collected on long-distance trade were not absorbed entirely by local defense spending. Large portions could be transferred directly into imperial accounts. During the late Republic, total state revenues were measured in the hundreds of millions of sesterces. Major conquests increased that base, but not enough to guarantee long-term sustainability for an expanded empire with permanent armies. When Egypt came under Roman control, it initially produced only moderate returns because its economy had been weakened. That situation changed quickly. Administrative reform and, even more importantly, the rapid expansion of Indian Ocean trade transformed Egypt into a fiscal powerhouse. Within a few years, traffic between Egyptian ports and the eastern seas multiplied several times over. Customs receipts surged. Agricultural taxes were restored to earlier high levels. The combined effect lifted imperial income dramatically and relieved the financial pressure that had worried early imperial planners. With Egyptian revenues approaching several hundred million sesterces per year, the empire's total income rose to a level that could support a large professional army and an expanded administrative system. Military reform followed. Soldiers were paid more regularly and in cash. Frontier defences were strengthened and stabilised. At the same time, experienced rulers warned against endless expansion, recognising that every new conquest added permanent cost. The financial breathing room created by Eastern trade allowed consolidation rather than reckless growth. As trade continued to grow, customs collections increased further. Under cautious rulers who preferred saving to spending, large surpluses accumulated in the treasury. Later, emperors could spend enormous sums in short periods precisely because reserves had been built during years of strong commercial taxation. Prosperity also encouraged political generosity, including the restoration of client kingdoms and expensive building programs. Risky campaigns, such as the invasion of parts of Britain, became financially possible in an environment supported by Eastern trade income. By the later 1st century, Egypt's contribution to imperial finances had become extraordinary. The province combined agricultural taxation with customs duties from Eastern commerce on a scale unmatched elsewhere. Contemporary observers emphasized how much money and grain Egypt delivered to Rome every year. Control of Egypt effectively meant control of a dominant share of the empire's ready cash and a major portion of the food supply for the capital. This concentration of wealth created political danger. Any general who secured Egypt could potentially choke the empire's finances and food distribution. For that reason, the province was governed under special restrictions. Its governor was chosen from a rank below the Senate. Senators were barred from entering without permission, and local political autonomy was tightly limited. Financial security and political control were treated as inseparable. Trade was not the only source of imperial money. Mining also played a crucial role. Precious metal extraction in western provinces, especially in Spain, produced vast quantities of silver and gold each year. Newly mined bullion fed the mint. Fresh coinage was struck and paid out to soldiers across the frontiers. This constant injection of new money into circulation helped offset the steady export of precious metals toward Eastern markets. Arabian and Indian traders often preferred payment in bullion, especially silver and gold. Large quantities left the empire each year in exchange for spices, silks, gems, and aromatics. As long as mining output remained strong, the outflow did not destabilize the currency supply. Bullion exchange with India also influenced how Romans valued gold and silver relative to one another. Different regions favored different ratios. Where silver commanded a higher value compared with gold, coins and bullion flowed in predictable directions through trade. Adjustments to coinage standards under later emperors reflect awareness that metal values in the marketplace did not always match older official ratios. Monetary reform, including the reduction of silver content in certain coins, helped realign currency with commercial reality, shaped in part by Eastern exchange. The broader Roman economy was transformed by this surge in long-distance commerce. Control of the Mediterranean had already created a large integrated market, but opening the Indian Ocean routes intensified activity to a new level. Production expanded to meet foreign demand. Italian wine travelled to eastern ports. Workshops in Egypt produced goods styled for Arabian and Indian buyers. Natural resources inside the empire were exploited more aggressively for export. Coral harvesting increased to satisfy Eastern tastes for decoration, reducing natural stocks. Other valuable plants were over-collected because fashion and medicine drove prices high enough to encourage exhaustion of supply. Consumer desire reached into ecosystems. Cultural critics noticed the social change that accompanied this commercial boom. Items once associated with military honor or ritual use became fashion accessories. Armor gave way to lighter and more luxurious clothing. Rare materials moved from sacred or ceremonial contexts into everyday display. Writers expressed amazement that people would dig deep into the earth, dive into distant seas, and cross entire continents simply to decorate their bodies. What earlier generations treated as exceptional became normal in an age of global trade. Rome itself stood at the center of this system, not only as a consumer, but as a redistribution hub. Its population approached 1 million people, making it the largest urban market in the Western world. That population required enormous quantities of staple goods and create constant demand for luxury items as well. Traders from across the empire converged on the city because prices were high and buyers plentiful. Information about shortages and surpluses travelled with merchants and cargo. Regions with excess production sent goods toward Rome. Regions facing deficits sent buyers. The capital functioned like a giant clearinghouse where supply met demand on an imperial scale. Observers from the provinces often described Rome's wealth in commercial terms. Lists of goods associated with the city's prosperity frequently highlighted Eastern luxuries alongside domestic products. Spices, incense, silk, precious stones, carved ivory, scented woods, and fine textiles appeared as symbols of its global reach. To outside eyes, Rome looked like the end point of the world's trade routes, a place where the products of distant forests, mines, and seas gathered in one marketplace. Ships sailing from Alexandria played a crucial role in this system. They brought grain in volumes large enough to feed the capital for months at a time, along with high-value Eastern cargo. These ships often arrived heavily loaded and departed much lighter because there were few Western goods that Eastern markets wanted in equal quantity. As a result, merchants frequently returned to Egypt, with profits largely in cash. This pattern had important financial consequences. Even though the imperial government withdrew huge sums from Egypt as tax revenue, commercial profits flowing back from Roman markets replenished the province's money supply. Currency conversion between Roman and Egyptian issues generated additional tax income and required the state to maintain large reserves of coin for exchange. In effect, the wider Roman population funded a significant share of imperial revenue through its appetite for imported luxuries. Customs duties paid by merchants were built into retail prices. When a soldier on a distant frontier bought pepper or perfume, part of that purchase ultimately supported Egyptian tax revenues and, through them, the imperial budget. The system operated like a feedback loop. Strong demand for Eastern goods increased trade volume. Higher trade volume increased customs receipts. Higher receipts funded the army and administration that protected the trade routes. As long as demand continued, the cycle reinforced itself. This arrangement had another advantage from the government's perspective. It produced vast revenue with relatively little administrative machinery. Only a limited number of ports and checkpoints needed tight control. A modest military presence at key desert routes and harbours could secure a revenue stream that formed a large fraction of the imperial budget. Because so much money came from commerce rather than direct agricultural taxation, provincial elites could often be left in place with lighter interference. That reduced resentment and lowered the risk of rebellion. Stability and profit aligned. For a long stretch of imperial history, Rome operated inside an economic machine that could absorb shocks and keep moving. Emperors presided over a system that looked stable on the surface because it was fed by extraordinary streams of money. That money did not come evenly from every province. It relied heavily on the careful handling of trade and taxation, tied to Egypt, the Red Sea routes, and the wider exchange with India and other eastern markets. Two cities sat at the heart of this arrangement. Alexandria functioned as a hinge between worlds, receiving goods, money, and information from one direction and sending them onward in another. Rome, meanwhile, acted as the ultimate stage where profits were realized, because it was the place where demand was deepest and prices could climb the highest. The calm Mediterranean, policed and protected, served as the corridor binding these centres together. Around them lay large settled provinces that worked like a protective belt, while the distant borders were held by a professional army designed to contain outside pressure. Imperial prosperity also depended on the steady output of precious metal from mining regions. Those supplies mattered because Eastern commerce constantly pulled gold and silver outward. As long as new bullion could be brought in and minted, the system could tolerate that drain. Disasters did occur. A volcanic eruption might destroy towns and shipping, fires might damage supply regions, storms might wipe out cargoes, and harvest failures could strain markets. Yet the trade web was so broad and the incentives so strong that these events rarely broke the whole structure. Losses could be absorbed, routes could shift, and commerce could recover. For generations, this resilience reinforced the belief that Roman power was not only strong, but permanent. By the middle of the 2nd century, imperial finances had reached a peak that later ages would remember with envy. The treasury could hold sums so large that successors inherited enormous reserves without having to raise emergency taxes. Revolts might flare in distant corners, and frontier raids could scar borderlands. But the empire's core did not depend on every outer region to function. The central government had enough money and manpower to crush uprisings or repel invasions with overwhelming force. Civil war remained the most dangerous internal risk. Yet even these struggles tended to be decided quickly once one side gained access to Egypt's financial engine. No rival state in the Western world was strong enough to defeat Rome outright, and the great powers farther east were simply too distant to pose a direct military threat. In this climate, imperial messaging easily drifted toward the idea of endless Roman rule. Then came a crisis that armies could not intimidate and fortresses could not stop. A disease, invisible and microscopic, travelled along the same routes that carried goods and wealth. It moved out of Central Asia and into the connected populations of the ancient world. It struck cities, camps, ports, and marketplaces with equal indifference. The great empires of the age could deploy soldiers, build walls, and collect taxes, but they couldn't order a virus to surrender. When the pandemic reached East Asia, it tore through the population with terrible speed. Frontier forces suffered massive losses as soldiers died or were left too weak to serve. Confidence in the state began to crack, not because the government lacked authority, but because authority was useless against a threat that did not negotiate. In time, the Eastern Empire's political cohesion unraveled into conflict and fragmentation. The Roman world suffered its own version of the same disaster. The plague reached the fortified lines of the north and cut through the legions more effectively than any enemy coalition could have managed. It spread in the empire's busiest arteries, in the crowded centres where trade was conducted, and people constantly pressed together. Markets that had once symbolised prosperity became channels of infection. The very connectivity that had enriched the empire now accelerated its vulnerability. The consequences were not only demographic. The Roman state had gradually increased its commitments over generations. Earlier rulers had understood that expansion created long-term costs, but as revenue surged, later emperors added territories that were expensive to hold and raised military spending to match new strategic ambitions. By the 2nd century, the government had become accustomed to high income linked, directly or indirectly, to commercial activity. When the pandemic struck, it did not just kill people. It reduced the energy of the entire economic system. Trade slowed, demand faltered, supply chains broke, tax receipts suffered. The government discovered that the old balance could no longer be assumed. For the first time in many decades, state income fell short of what was needed to fund the army at full strength. At the same moment, pressure from beyond the northern frontier increased. The societies outside the Mediterranean core were not affected in the same way. Without huge cities and constant urban crowding, and without large garrisons living in tight quarters, disease had less opportunity to devastate their manpower. As Roman frontier forces weakened, a major wave of attacks followed. A powerful tribal coalition pushed hard against the borders, taking advantage of Roman exhaustion. The situation grew so serious that later, writers compared it to the most dangerous wars of the Republic, moments when Italy itself had seemed threatened. The fear was simple. If the invasion could not be checked, the empire's dominance might collapse. In that emergency, the empire was led by a ruler famous not for flamboyance, but for discipline and endurance. The emperor gathered shattered forces and rebuilt fighting strength through extraordinary measures. Traditional recruiting could not fill the gaps fast enough, so new sources of manpower were tapped. Slaves were trained for service. Fighters from the arenas were armed. Outlaw bands were pulled into the ranks. City watchmen were militarized. Even foreign auxiliaries were recruited to fight against their own kin across the frontier. It was a desperate improvisation, but it produced enough force to stabilize the line. The war itself unfolded under the shadow of continuing illness. Campaigns were fought while civilians and soldiers alike died in large numbers. The emperor spent down the accumulated wealth of earlier reigns to keep the army functioning, but even enormous reserves can be drained by prolonged crisis. When the treasury ran thin, the state looked for money without pushing provincial communities into open anger. Public auctions of imperial treasures became a tool of survival. Luxurious furnishings, exquisite vessels, embroidered garments, and the jewels of earlier courts were converted into cash to pay troops and sustain the war effort. The empire survived the invasion. The borders were restored and the system did not collapse immediately. Yet the cost was profound. the emperor himself eventually fell to the same disease that had ravaged the population. The mood that followed was darker, and later observers described a fall from an age of splendor into an age of harshness and decay. The old stability had relied on a surplus created by trade and taxation in a world of confidence. After the pandemic, that surplus was gone, and the problems that came next carried the unmistakable mark of declining revenue. The Eastern trade network never returned to its earlier strength in the same form. As income remained strained, the army's relationship with the state became more dangerous. Soldiers needed pay that could actually purchase food and supplies, and they became increasingly willing to intervene in politics to secure it. Regional armies backed their own commanders for the throne. Civil wars multiplied. Each new ruler inherited the same fiscal reality and discovered that it was impossible to satisfy every frontier at once. Favouring one region meant neglecting another, and neglect produced fresh rebellions and more claimants. Political supremacy drifted away from civic legitimacy and toward raw force. The state began to fear its own armies as much as any external enemy. With revenues insufficient, rulers resorted to manipulating the currency. Debasement became an emergency habit. Less precious metal in coins, more coins produced, and the illusion of adequate funds. At first, this could delay crisis. Over time, it made everything worse. Soldiers were paid in money that bought less and less. Merchants became reluctant to bring goods to frontier markets if payment was unreliable. Supply systems weakened. When trade failed, military authorities often began to take what they needed directly from local communities, which deepened resentment and damaged production further. A vicious cycle emerged. Insecurity reduced commerce reduced revenue. Reduced revenue weakened the army, and a weakened army generated more insecurity. A century after the Great Pandemic, the silver currency had lost much of its real value. Inflation rose as more devalued money chased the same goods. Prices climbed, shortages spread, and confidence declined. Eventually, a new regime attempted to rebuild the system through sweeping reforms. The state accepted a larger role in organizing supplies for the army, not simply paying wages and trusting markets to deliver. That required more officials, more records, and more oversight. Taxes rose to fund the larger administrative machine. With more bureaucracy came more opportunities for corruption, and the later empire struggled with that burden for generations. Administration also grew too heavy to be managed efficiently from a single centre. Authority hardened into a division between eastern and western halves. The eastern half remained comparatively resilient because it contained older, wealthier urban regions with deep commercial traditions. The western half was more exposed. Many of its provinces had been added through conquest of broad agricultural zones that were expensive to defend and had never been as rich in surplus as the eastern cities. They had developed under Roman rule, but development did not always translate into large fiscal margins for the central state, especially after repeated wars. The 3rd century of conflict also changed the character of the army. The veteran legions that had once been a disciplined instrument of imperial power were worn down by civil wars and financial stress. Later, armies often lacked the same training, cohesion, and equipment. With reduced funds and weaker forces, rulers leaned more heavily on allied groups from beyond the frontier. Earlier empires had used such allies and absorbed them through settlement and service. In the later period, the institutions needed for full integration were weaker. Large foreign communities entered imperial territory under negotiated terms, often keeping their own leadership and identity. The army recruited from them so extensively that the line between Roman soldier and foreign warrior blurred. This dependence intensified when new pressures swept in from the Eurasian steppe. As nomadic forces pushed westward, they destabilized existing societies and triggered migrations. Entire populations crossed into Roman lands, seeking security, land, and survival. In exchange for settlement, they offered military service, but settlement also reduced the taxable base and created powerful communities inside imperial borders, with loyalties that did not always align with the state. Over time, some of the most influential commanders in the Western Empire were foreign-born leaders, whose authority rested on troops more than on tradition. They navigated Roman court politics, used elite rivalries to their advantage, and gradually replaced imperial unity with a patchwork of competing kingdoms. The Western Empire might have endured longer with decisive, sustained assistance from the wealthier East, but that level of support did not materialize. Without the fiscal backing once provided by the Eastern-centered trade world, Western Europe struggled to maintain complex institutions at the old scale. In many regions, economic life simplified, long-distance exchange weakened, and political order reorganized around new powers. The Eastern Roman world survived, reshaped, and eventually known by another name, carrying forward many features of classical culture for centuries after the West had fractured. The long afterlife of Rome also shaped later worlds in unexpected ways. Classical learning, preserved in Eastern centers, later helped ignite intellectual transformation in Western Europe when scholars and texts moved across the Mediterranean. Maps and geographical ideas inspired new exploration, driven again by the desire to reach Eastern markets and their profits. In a bitter historical echo, the same kinds of diseases that had once shaken ancient empires travelled with explorers into new lands. Populations without long exposure suffered catastrophic losses, while newcomers carried partial resistance developed over generations. As new continents were drawn into global systems, vast mineral wealth flowed into European economies, fueling a new era of expansion and aggressive trade. In later centuries, histories of Rome were often told as triumphal stories, centered on great men and European achievement, with far less attention given to the wider networks that had made the empire rich. The merchants, sailors, and diverse communities who negotiated in distant markets faded from the main narrative. Rome's cultural prestige became a tool in modern ideologies used to justify dominance while ignoring how dependent the ancient empire had been on Eastern roots, Eastern products, and the participation of many non-European peoples. Seen in a broader frame, the Roman experience reads less like a simple rise and fall and more like a lesson in global interdependence. The empire's strength grew from connectivity, secure seas, reliable taxation, productive mines, and a trade system that linked distant regions without direct conquest. Its vulnerabilities also grew from that same connectivity. Pandemics travelled the routes of commerce, fiscal stability depended on trade continuing, and the political centre became dangerously tied to a few key provinces and corridors. The ancient world offers a reminder that prosperity built on long supply lines and complex markets can appear permanent, right up until the moment it is not. A fuller understanding of Rome therefore demands a wider lens. The empire's achievements were extraordinary, not only because of its armies and institutions, but because it sat inside a truly international economy. Eastern producers gained from Roman demand. Roman taxpayers and consumers funded state revenues through their purchases. The government profited from trade without having to conquer the distant regions that supplied it. When Rome is placed back into that global setting, the classical world becomes more complex than the familiar stories suggest, and the forces that sustained imperial power, look less like isolated genius and more like the management of an interconnected world.